seconds, you will hear the heavy rain sound as I am hearing while driving, but no worries. When the story starts, it will all calm down naturally and make the atmosphere soothing so you can relax for the rest of the night. When the sun goes down, the demands of the day don't always stop echoing in your mind. The endless to-do lists, the quiet pressures, and the weight you've been carrying all week can make sleep feel so far away. But right now, you can finally put all of that down. You've made it through another long day, and your mind deserves a soft place to land. Welcome home. I'm Deb, and this is True Horror Stories Film. If you need a quiet space to unwind every night, take a moment to subscribe, like the video, and drop a comment below sharing what's keeping you up or what you're escaping from tonight. You are completely safe here in our little corner of the dark. Let the outside world fade away as we begin. Hey, still up. I figured you would be. This is Warden, and for the next while, you do not have to hold anything by yourself. If you want, tell me down in the comments what kept you awake tonight. I read those, even the ones I do not answer. All right. Let us get you somewhere else for a while. Denny Ostrander got the call at 11:42 p.m., which was 18 minutes before his shift technically ended, which meant the dispatcher either did not check the clock or did not care to. The job was a rekey, Unit 4C, a building called the Averline on the east side, a vacated tenant. Landlord wanted the locks changed before the next occupant moved in on the first. Denny had worked for Corrigan Lock and Key for 6 years. He took the job because the Averline paid a after-hours premium of $40, and because refusing calls this late in his tenure had a way of getting back to Marcus, who scheduled the following week. The Averline was 11 stories, pre-war brick with a limestone band at the second floor, the kind of building that had been carved into 100 small apartments, sometime in the 1920s, and never fully recovered its original shape. Denny had been inside twice before, both daytime jobs, both unremarkable. He parked his van on Ellery Street at 11:58, gathered his case, and let himself went into the lobby with the code the property manager had texted him. The lobby smelled like radiator dust and old paint. A directory board listed tenants by floor and letter, half the little plastic slots blank, a few of them holding names typed on a machine that had not been manufactured in 30 years. He found the elevator, a narrow cage model that groaned when it started moving, and pressed 4. The panel had buttons for floors 1 through 11, a basement button marked B, and beneath that, a button with no marking at all, the plastic worn smooth where a label should have been. Denny had seen unmarked buttons before. Usually a mechanical room, sometimes a super's apartment. He did not think about it again until the elevator passed the 3rd floor, and the numbers above the door skipped from 3 to 5. He assumed it was a fluke of the display, the kind of thing that happened in buildings this old, wiring patched over decades by whoever was cheapest at the time. The doors opened on a hallway with a sign that read Floor 4 in the same worn brass as everything else, so he let it go. The hallway carpet was green, threadbare down the center, where 90 years of feet had worn a path. Unit 4C was the 3rd door on the left. Denny knocked once out of habit, though the tenant had already moved, and let himself in with the property manager's master key. The apartment was empty in the particular way. Vacated apartments are empty, furniture gone, walls bearing the ghost outlines of picture frames in slightly different paint. A single light bulb burning in the kitchen, because someone at some point had decided electricity should stay on until the unit turned over. Denny set his case on the counter and got to work on the deadbolt, a standard quickset that had probably been rekeyed a dozen times across a dozen tenants. He worked quickly, the way you work when the job pays overtime but your own bed is 25 minutes away. It took him 14 minutes to finish the deadbolt and the knob set, faster than the estimate Corrigan gave the property manager, which Denny always thought was funny, since nobody but him would ever know how long it actually took. He packed his case, checked the door swung correctly, and pulled a small paper tag from his pocket to loop onto the new keys, the way the company required. He wrote the unit number in ballpoint pen, 4C. Then he looked up at the number stamped into the brass plate above the peephole, the original builder's plate. Then he looked up at the number stamped into the brass plate above the peephole, the original builder's plate, the kind that had probably been there since 1927. It read 5C. Denny stood there a moment with the tag in his hand. He checked the work order on his phone again. Unit 4C. Tenant name Halloran R. He checked the door he had just rekeyed. The brass plate, worn but legible, said 5C. He assumed the property manager had made an error, or that the building had been renumbered at some point, and the plates were never updated, which was common enough in old stock. He crossed out 4C on the tag and wrote 5C instead, because the plate was what a future locksmith would see, and consistency mattered more than the paperwork. He locked up, tested both new keys, and walked back to the elevator. He did not look at the hallway sign again on his way out, which he would later think about more than almost anything else that happened that night. Because if he had looked, would have known sooner. The elevator arrived. He pressed L for lobby. The cage groaned upward first, a half-second delay before it began its descent, the mechanism working out some old confusion of its own, and then it dropped, counting down past 3, past 2, and stopped at 1 without incident. In the lobby, Denny texted the property manager, a woman named Priya, who handled 6 buildings for the same ownership group, told her the unit's builder plate read 5C, not 4C, and asked if she wanted the tag corrected on her end or if he should just leave it as he had labeled it. She wrote back within a minute. "That is strange," she said. "My records say 4C. There is no 5C in that building. The building goes 1 through 11 with no 5th floor. It was condemned in a partial collapse in 1958, and the floor above was renumbered to absorb it." Denny read the message twice. He was standing in the lobby, and the directory board was in front of him. The same board he had glanced at 25 minutes earlier without really reading it. He looked now. Floor 1, Floor 2, Floor 3, Floor 4, Floor 6. There was no 5 on the board at all, the numbers skipping the way the elevator's display had skipped, and he had noted that and dismissed it, and now he stood in a quiet lobby at 12:14 in the morning, with a photograph in his head of a brass plate that had definitely, unmistakably, said 5C. He texted Priya back, asked if he could go verify. She said sure, though her tone through the text felt like she was humbling a client rather than answering a real question. The kind of sure that meant she thought he had misread a worn plate in bad lighting. Denny took the elevator up again. This time he watched the number display the entire ride, the way you watch a pot that you have decided, against your better judgment, might actually boil early. 1, 2, 3, then 5. The doors opened onto the same hallway, green carpet, the same worn path down the center. The sign at the end of the hall still read Floor 4. He walked to what had been Unit 4C, now freshly rekeyed by his own hands 30 minutes earlier, and looked at the brass plate above the peephole in the better light of the standing hall lamp. It read 4C. Denny stood very still. He had photographed the plate on his phone as part of the standard job documentation Corrigan required, a habit that had saved him from liability disputes twice before. He opened his camera roll. The photo, timestamped 12:03 a.m., showed the brass plate clearly, no blur, good exposure from his headlamp. It read 5C in the photo. It read 4C on the door in front of him now. 16 minutes later, he told himself several things in quick succession, the way a person does when the alternative is unacceptable. That the plate had been recently replaced, and he had not noticed a workman in the hall, which was absurd at this hour. That he was tired, that 6 years of night calls had finally produced the kind of exhaustion that made a man misread numbers, that the photo's timestamp was wrong, that his phone had glitched. He zoomed into the photograph until the brass grain filled the screen. 5C. He looked at the door. 4C. Both were real in the way that only one of them should have been able to be. A door opened 3 units down the hall, Unit 4F according to its plate. Though Denny found he no longer trusted plates in this building the way he had an hour ago. A man stepped out, elderly, wearing a cardigan over pajama pants, the kind of resident who probably kept the same hours regardless of the actual time. Up, because up was simply where he was tonight. He looked at Denny with mild curiosity, rather than alarm. The look of someone accustomed to strangers in the hallway at strange hours. Workmen and movers, and locksmiths passing through a building that turned over tenants constantly. The man asked if Denny was working on 4C. Denny said yes. The man said the Halorans had lived there 11 years before they left, and that he had liked them, and that the wife used to leave a plate of cookies outside her door around the holidays for whoever happened to walk by. Denny asked, carefully, whether the man remembered the unit ever being called anything other than 4C. The man said no, not in 34 years in this building, though, he added, almost as an afterthought, that the building used to feel different before the renovation. Denny asked what renovation. The man said the one after the collapse, the partial one, back in 1958. Before his own time here, though the story got passed down the way old building stories do, tenant to tenant, embellished a little each time it changed hands. He said the 5th floor had come down into the 4th, not all the way. Just enough that the building had to close for 8 months while they shored up what remained, and folded the 2 floors into one taller floor with the same footprint, which was why, if you looked close, the ceilings on 4 were higher than anywhere else in the building. Denny had not noticed the ceiling height. He looked up now. The old man was right. The hallway ceiling here sat noticeably higher than it had in the lobby, high enough that the light fixture hung on a longer chain than made sense for a standard renovation. The old man said something else then, quieter, less like a story he had told before, and more like something he was working out as he said it. He said that sometimes, late at night, you could still hear someone walking on the floor that was not there anymore. Footsteps in the ceiling where there was no ceiling to walk on. Just the crawl space between what 4 used to be and what 5 used to be before they became one thing, wearing one number. Denny asked if that happened often. The old man said not often, maybe a handful of times in 34 years. He said it always started the same way. A faint 2-step rhythm directly overhead, moving from one end of the hall to the other and back, unhurried, the pace of someone checking each door. He said the last time it happened was 6 years ago. The same month, a locksmith had come to rekey a different unit on this floor. A coincidence the old man had never mentioned to anyone, because it sounded foolish out loud, and he was only saying it now because Denny had asked a strange enough question that it seemed like the kind of night where the foolish thing might actually matter. The old man said goodnight and went back into 4F, and Denny heard the deadbolt turn twice, which was one more time than necessary for a single-cylinder lock, though he understood the impulse. He stood alone in the hallway. It was 12:31 a.m. He had a work order that said 4C, and a photograph that said 5C, and a building that, according to public record, if he cared to check in the morning, had only ever had 11 floors, and had never officially had a 5th at all. Not since 1958, not on paper, not on the directory board. And yet the brass plate in his own photograph disagreed with 90 years of city filing in a way that a tired locksmith at midnight had no framework for resolving. He decided to leave. This seemed, in the moment, like the correct decision, the kind of decision a sensible person makes when a job is finished, and the building has started producing more questions than his pay grade covered. He walked to the elevator, pressed the call button, and waited the 20 or so seconds it usually took the old cage to arrive. While he waited, he heard it. Not loud. A 2-step rhythm somewhere above the drop ceiling tiles at the end of the hall. Unhurried, moving away from him toward the far end of the corridor. Then pausing, then resuming, moving back. The elevator arrived. Denny got in fast enough that he barely registered doing it, the case banging against his knee, and pressed L twice. The second press pointless, but somehow necessary. The doors closed. The cage began its ascent then descent ritual, a half-second upward hitch before it committed to going down, and Denny watched the numbers. 4. Then, for exactly 1 flicker, not long enough to be sure he had not imagined it, the display showed 5, a number that on every prior ride had appeared as a smooth, transitionless skip between 3 and 4, never separately, never on its own, and this time it sat there, glowing, for what felt like a full second before the elevator corrected itself and continued to 3, to 2, to 1. The lobby was empty. Denny walked out through the front door into the cold, the kind of March cold that felt colder for how recently it had been warm, and got into his van. He sat there for a minute, without starting the engine, running his thumb over the edge of his phone case, not looking at the photograph again, though he knew he would look at it eventually, probably more than once, probably at 3 in the morning some night in the next 2 weeks, when he could not sleep and needed a reason not to think about why. He texted Priya that the job was complete, both keys tested, tag corrected to 4C per her records. He did not mention the photograph. He did not mention the old man, or the footsteps, or the flicker on the elevator display. He told himself this was because none of it belonged in a work completion text, which is true, and also because he suspected that saying it out loud, even in writing, even to a property manager he barely knew, would make it a fact rather than a tired man's misperception, and he was not ready for it to be a fact yet. He drove home. He did not think about the Averline again for 9 days, which was a shorter stretch than it should have been, for something that strange. But Denny had learned a long time ago that the mind protects itself by simply declining to revisit certain rooms, and his mind apparently had a spare one available. On the 9th day, Marcus called him into the office before his shift and told him Corrigan had gotten another work order from the same ownership group, the same building, a rekey for a vacated unit on the 5th floor. Denny said the Averline did not have a 5th floor. Marcus looked at the printed order, looked back at Denny, and said the address matched, and the floor was listed as 5, Unit A, and the tenant name on file was blank, which happened sometimes with long-term units where the paperwork had never been properly updated. And did Denny want the job, or should he pass it to someone else? Denny said he would take it. He told himself this was because passing jobs made Marcus remember your name for the wrong reasons. And that was true too, though it was not the whole of it. He drove to the Averline that evening, arriving at 11:50, 8 minutes earlier than the last time, and let himself into the lobby with the same code, which had not changed. The directory board looked the same, 1 through 4, then 6 through 11. No 5, nowhere on any of the little plastic slots, exactly as it had been 9 days earlier. He took the elevator. He pressed 4, because that was the only way he knew to reach the floor the old man had described. The folded floor, the one wearing 2 numbers stacked inside a single height of ceiling. The cage groaned, climbed its half-second hitch, and descended past 3. The display skipped to 5, not 4. 5. Denny watched the number sit there, steady this time. No flicker, no correction, as though the elevator had simply decided, this visit, that this was the floor that existed tonight. The doors opened onto a hallway that looked identical to the one from 9 days ago. The same green carpet worn down the center, the same brass sconces, except that where the sign at the end of the hall had read floor 4, it now read floor 5. The brass, slightly less tarnished, as though it had been polished more recently, or used less. Denny stood in the elevator doorway with his case in his hand for longer than the door's auto-close timer allowed, and had to step forward to keep them from shutting on him. He checked the work order again, Unit 5A. He walked down the hall. The doors were lettered the same as before. C where C had been, F where F had been, and near the end, where he remembered nothing at all from his last visit because he had never had reason to look, there was a door marked A, tucked into a short recess in the hallway that felt structurally like it should not have fit inside the building's footprint. An architectural impossibility he did not have the vocabulary to name, but could feel in the way the hall seemed to narrow just before it. He unlocked the door with the property manager's master key, which worked without hesitation, and stepped into Unit 5A. The apartment was furnished. This was the first wrongness he registered, more immediate than anything about the numbers, because every vacated unit he had ever rekeyed in 6 years had been empty, and this one had a sofa, a coffee table, a lamp burning on a side table with the same low wattage as the kitchen bulb in 4C had been 9 days earlier. The furniture was not new. It had the particular staleness of furniture that had been in one place a very long time. The upholstery, worn in the shape of a body, that had sat there often enough to leave an impression. Denny called out, "The way you are supposed to when you let yourself into a unit that might not actually be vacant despite what the paperwork says." Nobody answered. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, weighing the $40 after-hours premium against every instinct currently telling him to leave, and the premium, as it always somehow did, won out over the instinct, though only barely, and only because leaving now meant coming back later, and later felt worse than now. He crossed the living room toward the bedroom door, noting as he went that the apartment's layout mirrored 4C almost exactly. The same bones, the same window placement, as though the building, in folding 2 floors into one, had also folded 2 identical apartments into a single haunted geometry that remembered both versions of itself at once. The bedroom door was closed. He knocked, the same habitual knock he had given Unit 4C 9 days ago, and when nothing answered, he opened it. The room was empty of furniture, unlike the living room. Just bare floorboards, and a single window facing the air shaft. And in the center of the floor, positioned with a precision that felt deliberate rather than accidental, sat a small brass plate, the twin of the one from the hallway door. Except this one read nothing at all, the surface smooth and blank where numbers should have been stamped, as though it were waiting to be told what floor it belonged to. Denny picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the building's heating. And as he turned it over in his hand, he heard, directly above him, through a ceiling that by every measurement he had taken in this building belonged to floor 6, and nothing else. The 2-step rhythm the old man had described, unhurried, moving from one end of the room to the other, pausing, resuming. He did not run, though he wanted to, because running felt like the kind of decision that made a story real, and some stubborn part of him was still trying to keep this as a misunderstanding he could walk away from. He left the blank plate on the coffee table in the living room, on the theory, unexamined but insistent, that it should not leave the apartment with him. He locked the door out of old habit, though he had never actually finished the rekey, and walked back down the hall toward the elevator, the footsteps overhead tracking his progress the entire way, matching his pace almost exactly 1 step behind. The elevator was waiting, doors open, as though it had known to expect him. He got in. The panel showed the same buttons as before, 1 through 11, B, and the unmarked button beneath, the plastic worn smooth. He pressed L. The doors closed. The footsteps overhead stopped the instant the doors sealed, and Denny stood in the sudden, total quiet of the cage as it began its familiar half-second hitch upward before committing to the drop. Except this time, for the first time in 6 years of riding that elevator, it did not stop. The display read 5. Then it read 5 again, the number not changing, the cage still descending by the feel of it in his stomach, the small lurch of motion continuing past what should have been floor 4, floor 3, floor 2, floor 1, the lobby, and still the display insisted 5, unmoving. while the cable in the floor and Denny's own inner ear told him the car had not stopped falling in what felt like a controlled, patient, unhurried way. The same pace as the footsteps, the same two-step rhythm translated into mechanical motion. Down and down, a lobby that should have arrived a full 20 seconds ago. Then, without any perceptible change in speed, the doors opened. The lobby. The directory board. The cold March air visible through the glass front doors. The display read L. Denny stood in the cage for several seconds without moving, the case still in his hand, the sensation of the drop still present in his stomach, the way a scent lingers after the thing that made it is gone. He walked out to his van, drove home, and did not text Priya that night at all. He filed the work order the following morning as incomplete, wrote on the paperwork that the tenant of record could not be located and the unit could not be accessed for rekey, which was, strictly, a lie. Though it was the only version of the truth Denny felt equipped to put in writing. Marcus never followed up. The Averline never called Corrigan Lock and Key again. Not for that unit, not for any unit. Not once in the 4 years Denny continued working there before he left the trade for a daytime job that had nothing to do with keys or old buildings or elevators, that counted floors the way something patient counts the days until it is noticed. He still has the photograph. Timestamp 12:03 a.m. Brass plate reading 5C, a floor the city has no record of, in a building that goes 1 through 4, and then 6 through 11 on every directory board he has ever checked since, including the one time, 2 years later, he drove past the Averline on his day off and went in under the excuse of checking his old work, and found the plate on 4C reading 4C, plain and correct, exactly as it should, except that above it, in the transom glass no wider than a hand, someone had fogged a small patch of condensation from the inside, and drawn with a fingertip a single unhurried number 5. Adele Kirsch had never met her great-aunt Ottilie Vantage, and knew almost nothing about her beyond the name, until a lawyer in Portland called on a Wednesday in September to inform her that she had inherited an 11-acre island 6 miles off the coast, along with the house standing on it, a structure the lawyer described with a carefulness that struck Adele even over the phone as a manor rather than a cottage. She was 38, worked as a book conservator for a small university library, and had spent her entire adult life in apartments too modest to require a will of her own. And so the news arrived less like an inheritance and more like a clerical error that had not yet been corrected. The lawyer, a measured man named Corwin Ash, who had handled the Vantage family's affairs for 22 years, explained the terms over a follow-up call 3 days later, reading from what he called the residency clause with the flat, practiced cadence of a man who had read it aloud many times before. The property, along with a trust valued at $640,000, would transfer to Adele in full, only if she resided continuously on the island for 90 days, beginning within 60 days of accepting the inheritance, with no absence exceeding 24 consecutive hours during that period. Should she leave before completing the 90 days, ownership would pass instead to a secondary trust whose beneficiaries were listed only as the current caretaking staff, a family named Pruitt. who had maintained the property for 3 generations. Adele asked why the clause existed. Ash said the Vantage family had included some version of the same residency requirement in every will for at least 4 generations, as far back as his firm's records extended, and that he had never been given a reason beyond family tradition. The kind of eccentric provision old money sometimes attached to old land, and that in his 22 years handling the account, every heir before Adele had simply completed the 90 days without incident and taken possession as expected. She took a leave of absence from the library, packed for what she assumed would resemble an unusually long and well-funded vacation, and arrived at Solitude Point on the 1st of October, ferried across by a quiet man named Hollis Pruitt, who introduced himself as the island's caretaker, and said little else during the 20-minute crossing beyond a few practical notes about the boat schedule and the location of the generator. The house was larger than the word manor had prepared her for. 14 rooms across 3 floors, built in the 1880s by a Vantage ancestor whose portrait hung in the front hall, a stern man with the particular flatness of expression common to 19th century photography, rather than any specific unfriendliness. Hollis's wife, Marguerite, managed the household, cooking and cleaning with an efficiency that suggested long practice. And their daughter, a woman in her 30s named Wren, handled the grounds and the boat. All 3 lived in a smaller cottage on the island's north side, visible from the manor's upper windows as a single warm light most evenings. Hollis walked her through the house on her first full day, a tour that felt, in retrospect, more procedural than welcoming. The specific thoroughness of a man checking that every door still opened the way it should, rather than a caretaker showing pride in what he maintained. He pointed out the generator shed, the cistern that supplied the house's water, the boathouse where Wren kept the ferry, and, almost as an afterthought near the end of the tour, a door on the 3rd floor that he described only as storage, locked, key kept downstairs. Nothing in it worth Adele's time. She noted the door without commenting on it, filing it under the general category of old house eccentricity, a category that would, over the following weeks, grow considerably more crowded than she expected. The first 2 weeks passed without anything Adele would later describe as strange, only the ordinary adjustment of a city-dwelling woman to an island with no cell signal, a generator that ran on a schedule rather than continuously, and a silence at night thick enough that she found herself, more than once, listening to her own house simply to hear something moving in it. She spent her days exploring the library, a genuinely remarkable collection that made her professional instincts sing despite everything else, and cataloging, out of habit, the books nobody had asked her to catalog. It was in the library, on the 19th day, that she found the first ledger, tucked behind a shelf of maritime histories in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than accident. It recorded, in a succession of different hands spanning what she estimated at 130 years, the names of every Vantage heir who had completed their 90 days, alongside a second column she initially assumed tracked household expenses, until she recognized the entries as dates, always falling within the 90-day window, always followed by a brief phrase in the margin. She is patient tonight. He does not sleep well when the wind comes from the north. She has stopped asking Marguerite about the noise. Adele brought the ledger to dinner that evening and asked Hollis directly what it recorded. He set down his fork with the deliberate stillness of a man deciding how much of an answer a question actually deserved, and said only that every family that had ever lived on this island for any length of time kept some record of the adjustment period. The strange dreams and unfamiliar sounds that came with island living. Nothing more unusual than what any isolated household might note down to pass the time. Adele asked why the ledger had been hidden rather than left on a shelf. Hollis said he did not know it had been hidden at all, and changed the subject to the coming week's weather with a smoothness that told her, more clearly than any direct answer could have, that the subject was now closed. That night, the 19th of her residency, she woke at some hour she did not check, aware before she was fully conscious that the quality of silence in the house had changed, thickened in a way she associated, without being able to say why, with a held breath. She lay still for several minutes, telling herself this was simply an old house, settling the same reasonable explanation she had offered herself a dozen times over the previous 2 weeks, until she heard it clearly enough to rule out imagination. A single set of footsteps crossing the floor directly above her bedroom, unhurried, deliberate, moving from one end of the room to the other and stopping. Her bedroom occupied the top floor. There was nothing above it but the roof. She did not investigate. She lay awake instead, until the gray light of early morning made the room recognizable again, and went down to breakfast with a question already forming that she did not in the end ask, because Marguerite's expression when she set down the coffee carried the specific carefulness of someone bracing for exactly that question, and hoping quietly not to have to answer it yet. She began sleeping poorly after that, not from any specific disturbance, but from a general, low-grade awareness that had crept into the edges of her days. The sense of being observed from some vantage point in the house she could never quite locate when she turned to check. She mentioned this to Wren one afternoon, the two of them alone on the dock, while Wren coiled rope, with the unhurried competence of someone who had spent her whole life on this particular stretch of water. Wren said, without looking up from the rope, that the feeling usually settled in around week 3, and that most heirs described it the same way, and that it generally grew less noticeable, though never entirely absent, once you stopped fighting it. Adele asked what most heirs referred to, given that she had assumed, until that moment, that she was the first vantage in a generation to actually take up residence rather than simply inheriting from a distance. Wren looked up then, and something crossed her face that might have been surprise at Adele's ignorance, or might have been the particular caution of someone who had just realized she had said more than she meant to. She said only that the vantage line had a habit of sending someone out here every generation or so, sometimes an heir, sometimes someone the family had simply designated for the purpose, and that Adele should ask Mr. Ash about the Fuller family history if she wanted specifics, since the Pruitts had always considered it more their place to maintain the house than to explain it. Adele pressed a little further, asking whether Wren herself had ever considered leaving the island, given that her whole life, by her own account, had been spent in service to a family she was not related to, and a house whose true nature nobody seemed willing to fully name. Wren set down the rope she had been coiling and looked out toward the mainland, invisible past the morning haze, for long enough that Adele wondered if she had overstepped. When she finally answered, her voice had none of its earlier practical flatness. She said her grandfather had left once, briefly in his 20s, before he understood what the caretaking role actually required, and had come back within a year, unprompted, unable to explain to his own family why the island had started to feel less like a place he had escaped and more like a place he had misplaced himself from. She said every Pruitt she had ever known, going back as far as family stories reached, eventually came to some version of the same understanding, that some people simply belonged to Solitude Point in a way that had nothing to do with ownership, and that she had made her peace with being one of them a long time ago. Though she was careful, she added, to specify that her peace was not the same thing as contentment. Adele called Corwin Ash from the mainland-facing side of the island, where a weak signal occasionally reached, and asked him directly whether every Vantage heir for 4 generations had actually completed their 90 days, or whether some had failed to, and what happened to the ones who had. Ash was quiet long enough that Adele checked her phone to see if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the polished, practiced quality it carried during their earlier conversations, and he said carefully that 2 heirs in his own 22 years handling the account had left before completing their residency, both citing reasons that sounded, in his professional opinion, considerably more distressed than a simple change of heart about island living, and that both had died within 18 months of leaving Solitude Point. One by an accident he described only as sudden, the other by causes the family had never fully disclosed to his firm. He added, before she could ask a follow-up question, that he was required by the terms of his own retainer not to discuss the specifics of the residency clause's origin, a restriction that had been in place since before his own involvement with the family, and that his professional advice, offered as a friend rather than a lawyer, was to finish the 90 days, regardless of whatever she encountered, because in his 22 years of experience, every heir who had completed the residency, however uncomfortable those months had been, had gone on to live long, ordinary, healthy lives afterward, and every heir who had not completed it had not. Adele spent the following week in a state of controlled unease, cataloging books during the day with a concentration that felt increasingly like avoidance, and lying awake at night listening to a house that, she was now certain, made sounds it had not made during her first 2 weeks, footsteps on the 3rd floor she never investigated closely enough to disprove, a particular pressure in certain rooms that felt less like temperature and more like attention. On the 34th day, she found the key to the storage room Hollis had shown her on her first tour, sitting in an unmarked drawer in the kitchen, alongside spare fuses and a coil of picture wire, and decided, against every instinct that had kept her from asking too many direct questions over the previous month, to see for herself what he had been so eager not to discuss. The room, when she finally opened it, was smaller than she expected, windowless, and contained nothing but a single upright chair facing the wall, and on that wall, a series of shallow grooves worn into the plaster at roughly the height of a seated adult's hands, as though something had spent a great deal of time, over a great deal of years, pressing and dragging its fingers against the same narrow stretch of surface. She counted 4 distinct sets of grooves, overlapping in places, each set slightly different in width and spacing, and understood with a certainty she could not immediately justify that she was looking at the accumulated evidence of every vantage heir who had ever completed their residency in this house, sitting in that chair for some portion of their 90 days, doing whatever it was the house required of them in that particular room. She locked the door again and returned the key to its drawer, and did not mention the room to Hollis, and he did not ask whether she had found it. She found a second ledger on the 41st day, this one current, the most recent entries written in Marguerite's hand, and read, with a specific cold recognition, an entry dated 6 days earlier. She has begun to notice. This is usually around when they start asking real questions. Hollis thinks we should tell her more. I think the house will decide that on its own, same as it always has. She confronted Marguerite directly that same evening in the kitchen, holding the ledger between them, like evidence in a trial neither of them had agreed to hold. Marguerite looked at the book for a long moment, then at Adele, with an expression that held something closer to sympathy than guilt, and said, finally, that the island had always required a vantage, or a vantage-chosen occupant to be present. That the requirement predated any Pruitt's involvement by generations, and that the family's own records, the ones Corwin Ash was forbidden to discuss, traced the arrangement back to the original construction of the house itself, a bargain made by the ancestor in the front hall portrait, with something Marguerite would only describe as the water around the island, though she said this last part reluctantly, as though even saying it aloud risked drawing attention she would rather avoid. Adele asked what, specifically, the bargain had been for, since a bargain implied both an exchange and a reason, and 130 years of ledgers full of half-explained noises did not, on their own, tell her what the original ancestor had actually wanted or needed badly enough to trade his family's peace for it across 4 generations. Marguerite said that part of the story had not survived intact, even within the Pruitt family's own oral history, that her mother-in-law had once told her the original bargain concerned the safety of a ship, some disaster averted or some fortune secured in the earliest years of the house, but that the details had blurred the way old stories do when nobody alive still needs to remember the specifics, only the terms. She said the terms were the only part that mattered now, because the terms were the only part that still collected. Adele asked, what would happen if she simply left tomorrow, if she boarded Wren's boat and returned to the mainland and let the estate pass to the Pruitt Trust as the will allowed? Marguerite said, the will's penalty was only the visible half of the arrangement, the half a lawyer could put into language, and that the other half, the part that had killed 2 heirs in the last 22 years alone, according to Ash's own account, was not something the Pruitts had ever been able to protect anyone from once they had already left the island and broken whatever continuity the presence had maintained. She said, the safest thing, the only thing the Pruitts had ever seen actually work, across 3 generations of watching this happen, was to stay, to finish the 90 days, and to let whatever the island required settle itself the way it always had, quietly, without anyone needing to fully understand what it was. Adele has 26 days remaining as of this telling. She still catalogs books during the day, still eats dinner with the Pruitts, still listens every night to a house she now understands is not simply old and settling, but genuinely occupied by something patient enough to have waited out 4 generations of Vantage heirs without ever once losing what it was. Ode. She has begun in the last week, sitting in the chair in the storage room, voluntarily, in the evenings, after Marguerite has cleared the dinner dishes, and Hollis has gone down to check the generator for the night. She could not fully explain, if anyone asked her to, why she started doing this, only that the first time she sat there, drawn back to the room almost against her own judgment, the pressure she had been feeling throughout the house for weeks seemed to settle, briefly, into something that felt less like being watched and more like being acknowledged, a distinction she recognized as important without being able to say precisely why. She sits there now for an hour most nights, her own hands resting on the arms of the chair, not pressing against the wall the way the grooves suggested previous heirs eventually had. Not yet, though she has caught herself twice, reaching toward the plaster before catching the motion and pulling her hand back into her lap. She wrote to Corwin Ash last week, a letter rather than a call, since the signal on the mainland-facing shore had grown less reliable as the weather turned, asking him plainly whether the arrangement ever actually ended, whether any Vantage heir in his firm's 4 generations of records had gone on to live in this house permanently once their 90 days concluded, raised children here, grown old here, or whether every single one of them had left the island the moment their obligation technically lapsed and never returned, except, perhaps, to arrange for the next heir's introduction to Hollis, or whoever had held the caretaker's role at the time. She has not yet received a reply, though she suspects, turning the question over during her evening hour in the chair, that she already knows the answer, the same way she has come to know most things about this house lately, not through anything anyone has told her directly, but through a kind of settling certainty that arrives, unbidden, somewhere around midnight, and does not leave by morning. She has stopped asking Wren or Marguerite direct questions, because she has come to suspect, the way you come to suspect a diagnosis before a doctor says it aloud, that she already knows more than either of them is willing to confirm, and that the remaining 26 days will pass the way the first 64 did, with the house testing the exact edges of how much attention it can pay her before she breaks, and with Adele, each morning, waking to find she has survived one more night of being watched by something that has never yet, in 4 generations, been made to explain itself to anyone who stayed. What she has not yet decided, and does not know whether she will decide before day 90 arrives, is what she will do on the morning after her obligation technically ends, when the boat is available and the mainland is 6 miles away, and nothing in the will's language will require her to still be standing on this island. She finds, more often than she is willing to admit even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, that she is no longer entirely certain she wants to leave. I spent 11 years telling frightened families that any threat could be named, tracked, and locked out, and I believed every word of it completely, until the night a house proved me wrong about all three. I still install cameras for a living. I no longer believe what they show me is the whole picture. I spent 11 years as a residential security consultant, most of that time coming directly out of a technical crimes unit with a mid-sized suburban police department. The kind of work that trains you to believe, with something close to religious conviction, that every threat leaves a signature somewhere, a fingerprint, a data trail, a pattern in the timing of a crime that eventually gives up the person behind it if you are patient and precise enough in how you look. I left the department to go private because the money was considerably better and because I genuinely believed, at the time, that I was good enough at reading threats to keep frightened families safer than any badge ever could. I want you to hold on to that belief for a while, because it is the exact belief the house eventually used to take everything it wanted from me. I was hired, a little under 2 years before tonight, by a family who had just moved into a large Dutch colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street in an affluent New Jersey suburb. The kind of neighborhood with manicured hedges and sprinkler systems on timers, and a general settled assumption that nothing truly bad ever happens behind any of its front doors. They called me 2 weeks after closing on the house, considerably rattled, having received the first of what would become a long and escalating series of anonymous letters, unsigned, typed, delivered by hand rather than through the postal service, describing details about their daily routines that no ordinary stranger driving past the house should have had any reasonable way of knowing. I remember sitting in their kitchen that first afternoon, the letter itself spread flat on the table between us, and reading a passage that has never fully left me since, a line describing which upstairs bedroom the youngest daughter had chosen for herself, a detail the family had settled on privately among themselves, only 3 days before the letter arrived. The letter referred to the house, not as their home, but simply as the house, as though the structure itself held some prior, standing claim on the family that predated their ownership entirely, and it asked, in language calm enough to feel considerably worse than any outright threat would have, whether they had brought children into the house for it to watch grow up. I want to be honest with you about what I told that family in our very first meeting, because it is the single most important thing in this entire story, and it took me nearly 2 years to fully understand the weight of what I had actually said. I told them, with complete professional confidence, built on 11 years of reading exactly this category of anonymous harassment case, that letters like this one almost always trace back to someone with mundane, explainable motives, a disgruntled former neighbor, a bored local teenager who had grown up watching the house and resented the new family occupying it, occasionally a jilted former owner unable to let go of a property they had sold. I told them a properly monitored camera system, covering every entry point and the full perimeter of the property, would almost certainly resolve the matter within a matter of weeks, since anyone delivering letters by hand repeatedly to a specific address eventually makes a mistake in front of a lens. They believed me completely. I want you to understand that they had every reason to. I had the credentials, the calm delivery, the specific technical vocabulary that makes frightened people feel, for the first time since something terrifying entered their lives, that a competent professional has finally taken hold of the problem. I installed a full perimeter camera system within the week. Motion-activated lighting along every approach to the house. Monitored around the clock through a service I personally vouched for, and I told them, standing in their driveway after the installation was complete, that they could sleep considerably easier now. I believed every word of that too. I want that on the record clearly, because it makes everything that followed considerably harder to carry than if I had simply been lying to close a sale. The cameras caught nothing for the first several weeks. No approaching figure, no vehicle idling suspiciously nearby, nothing whatsoever to explain how a new letter continued arriving, hand-delivered, roughly every 3 to 4 weeks, tucked into the mailbox or slid beneath the front door mat sometime during hours when the system's motion sensors showed absolutely no activity along any monitored approach. I want to walk you through how I explained that gap to myself and to the family, because it is the first small thing in this story, and because the explanation I settled on, at the time, felt entirely reasonable. I told the family, and I told myself, that a patient, technically capable stalker familiar with the neighborhood's typical camera placement could plausibly identify and exploit blind spots along a property's edge, particularly where mature hedging or a neighbor's fence line created natural coverage gaps. I adjusted the system twice over those first 2 months, adding additional coverage along the property's northern boundary, where an overgrown hedge created exactly the kind of blind corridor I described. And each time, I told the family with renewed confidence that we had closed the gap the sender had been exploiting. Each time, within roughly a month, another letter arrived, and the footage showed nothing. I want to describe the second small thing carefully, because it is where my explanations began requiring considerably more effort to hold together than they had at the start. It was perhaps 4 months into my involvement with the family when I began reviewing the overnight footage myself, personally, rather than relying solely on the monitoring services' automated flagging, specifically searching for any anomaly the automated system might have missed. I found, across several nights spread over that month, brief, unexplained gaps in the recorded timestamp, never longer than 90 seconds, always occurring sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, during which the system's internal log showed continuous recording, while the actual footage itself, when I played it back, contained nothing but a still identical frame repeated across the gap, as though time had simply been asked to skip forward without anything having happened to fill the space. I brought this anomaly to the manufacturer's technical support line, and I want to be honest that the explanation I received, a plausible compression artifact occurring during firmware updates, pushed automatically overnight, was one I accepted considerably more readily than the evidence itself perhaps warranted. I told the family it was a minor technical glitch, unrelated to their situation, easily corrected with a firmware patch I personally oversaw installing that same week. I believed that explanation for almost the entire following month, right up until the exact same gap appeared again. Same duration, same narrow overnight window, on a system whose firmware I had personally verified was fully updated and current. I want to tell you about one good stretch of time during this period, because it happened, and it matters. And I do not want this story to feel like nothing but a slow accumulation of unexplainable gaps. The family's youngest daughter, perhaps 7 years old at the time, took a particular liking to me during my regular visits to service the system. And one bright Saturday afternoon in early autumn, while I was recalibrating a sensor near the back porch, she brought me out a glass of lemonade her mother had made, unprompted, simply because she had noticed I looked, in her words, thirsty and busy at the same time. I sat on the porch steps for perhaps 15 minutes that afternoon, drinking that lemonade in ordinary autumn moonlight while she told me, with great seriousness, about a school project involving the life cycle of a butterfly. And for those 15 minutes I felt nothing but the simple, unremarkable pleasure of an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary family's yard. It did not last. Nothing in this kind of story ever does. But it happened, and I have held on to it since, 'cause the warmth of that particular afternoon is exactly what made everything that followed feel so much colder in comparison. The letters, over the following several months, grew steadily more specific in ways that made my original explanation, a bored local teenager, increasingly difficult to sustain even in my own head, though I continued sustaining it out loud to the family for considerably longer than the evidence deserved. A letter arrived describing, in precise detail, a private conversation the parents had held between themselves, late one evening, with every door and window in the house closed, about whether they had made a mistake purchasing the property. Another described the exact arrangement of furniture in a room the family had rearranged only 2 days prior, a detail I confirmed myself, standing in that room, comparing the letter's description against what I could see in front of me with my own eyes. I want to be exact about the reveal pacing here, because it matters to how honestly I can tell you this story. By roughly the 60% mark of my 18 months working with this family, I possessed, if I am being completely honest with myself, more than sufficient evidence to know that whatever was producing these letters was not operating through any conventional mechanism my professional training had prepared me to counter. I did not permit myself to say so out loud, not to the family, not to my own colleagues, and least of all to myself in any sustained, honest way, until considerably later, closer to the very end of my time on that property. The gap between what I already understood and what I was willing to name, I have come to believe, is where the actual horror of this entire story lives, considerably more than in any single unexplained detail on its own. It was around the 10-month mark, well past the point where my original explanation had stopped being remotely adequate, that I began noticing the third recurring anomaly, and I want to walk you through it precisely, because it is the piece of evidence that finally, fully broke my ability to keep looking away. The monitored camera covering the house's main staircase, positioned to capture anyone moving between floors during overnight hours, began recording, roughly twice a month, a single frame in which the stairwell's shadow pattern did not match the fixed position of the exterior motion lighting responsible for casting it. I want to be precise about why this mattered so specifically to a man with my exact training. Shadow behavior from a fixed light source is entirely predictable, governed by simple, unchanging geometry, and any deviation from that predictable pattern indicates, without exception, either a moving light source or an object positioned somewhere the camera itself could not directly capture. I reviewed those frames dozens of times, adjusted the camera's angle twice, replaced the exterior fixture once entirely, and the anomalous shadow pattern continued appearing, unchanged, roughly twice a month, always during that same narrow window between 2 and 3 in the morning. I told the family, during this period, that the shadow anomaly was almost certainly a minor calibration issue with the camera's low-light sensor, an explanation I delivered with somewhat less conviction than I had managed a year earlier, though I still delivered it, because I had, by that point, built an entire professional relationship and a considerable amount of personal pride around being the person who could explain away whatever this house produced. It was on a night in the 16th month of my involvement, considerably closer to the point where the pattern's true shape finally became impossible to keep denying, that I decided, without telling the family, to conduct an overnight surveillance visit myself. Physically present in their home, watching the staircase camera's live feed directly rather than relying on recorded footage reviewed after the fact. I want you to understand what drove that decision, because it was not, at the time, fear so much as a kind of wounded professional pride, a refusal to accept that a system I had personally designed and installed could be failing to capture something that was clearly, repeatedly, occurring directly within its field of view. I set up in the family's living room around midnight, laptop open, live feed from the staircase camera displayed clearly, and I want to tell you honestly that for the first 90 minutes, nothing whatsoever occurred beyond the entirely ordinary stillness of a house at rest. It was at 2:17 in the morning. According to the timestamp, I have never once been able to stop checking in memory, that the feed's picture held perfectly steady, while the shadow along the third stair from the bottom shifted slowly and distinctly in a manner that matched the movement of something passing directly in front of the fixed exterior light source, a shift that should have required a physical object crossing that specific point. And yet the camera's frame itself, the actual visible image, showed the stairwell entirely empty throughout the shift. I did not simply accept this at face value, even in that moment, because 11 years of training does not release its grip easily. I walked, laptop still open and feed still displaying, directly to the base of that staircase myself, and I stood there, watching the live image on my screen, while simultaneously looking with my own eyes at the actual stairs in front of me, and the shadow, on the screen, continued its slow shift up toward the second stair, while the stairs themselves, directly in front of my physical eyes, remained completely, visibly empty the entire time. I want to describe what happened next, as precisely as my training has always demanded of me, because precision is the only thing I still fully trust from that entire period. The temperature in that stairwell dropped, distinctly and specifically, in a manner I felt clearly along my hands and the back of my neck, despite the rest of the house remaining entirely at its ordinary overnight temperature. A localized cold with a clear, definable edge to it, the way you feel the boundary of an open refrigerator door, without needing a thermometer to confirm it. I stood at the base of those stairs, cold air settling specifically around me, and nowhere else in that room, and I understood, with a plainness that arrived considerably more calmly than the moment itself deserved, that I had spent 18 months building an elaborate professional architecture of explanations, specifically to avoid standing exactly where I was now standing, in a cold that had no source, watching a shadow move where no object existed to cast it. I did not run. I want you to understand that fear this specific does not always look like fleeing, and mine, standing there, looked instead like simply refusing to move at all, until the cold eventually lifted, which it did, perhaps 40 seconds later, all at once, the way weather passes, rather than the way it fades gradually. The shadow on my screen, when I checked it again, had returned to its ordinary, predictable position, consistent once more with the fixed exterior light source. I told the family the following morning that I had conducted an overnight system check and found everything functioning within normal parameters. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it is, I believe now, the exact moment my debt to that family became something I could no longer pretend was simply professional in nature. I had personally witnessed with my own eyes a physical phenomenon my entire technical training told me was impossible, and I chose, in that moment, to protect my own professional certainty rather than to finally give that family the honest accounting they had been paying me for 18 months to provide. The letters continued for another 2 months after that night, growing steadily more specific, and I want to be honest, considerably more frightening in their content, describing not merely private conversations and rearranged furniture, but the exact contents of the youngest daughter's school bag on a given morning, details that required either physical access to the house's interior or some form of knowledge I still, to this day, have no framework capable of explaining. It was the family themselves, ultimately, who decided to sell, exhausted by 18 months of escalating dread that no security system, however thoroughly upgraded, had ever actually resolved. And I remember standing in their empty driveway on their final day in that house, watching the moving truck pull away, understanding for the first time, with complete clarity, exactly what my original reassurance had actually cost them, which was not merely money spent on cameras that never once caught anything meaningful, but 18 months of a false, purchased calm that had kept them living inside something considerably more patient and considerably less explainable than anything I had prepared them to face. I want to tell you now about the final piece of this story, the part that took place considerably closer to the telling itself, because it is the part that finally forced me to understand the shape of what I actually owe. I continued in the months following that family's departure, doing occasional consulting work for the property's new owners, a routine arrangement that came with the sale of the security system itself. And it was during a service visit this past autumn, nearly 2 years after my first meeting with the original family, that the new owners handed me an envelope that had arrived that same week, addressed not to them specifically, but simply in the same familiar, calm, typed script. I remembered clearly from 18 months of reviewing letters that were never, technically, mine to receive. To whoever is currently responsible for keeping this house safe, I want to describe opening that envelope precisely, because it is where I finally understood something about my own debt that I had spent 2 years avoiding. The letter did not address the new family living in the house at all. It addressed me, specifically, by the exact professional title I had used with the original family 2 years earlier. And it stated, in language calm enough to feel considerably worse than any outright threat could have managed. That the house had been watching how carefully I watched it, and that a man who once promised total safety to a family he could not actually protect owed the house an accounting of his own before it would consider its business with him finished. I sat in my car outside that property for a long while after reading it, understanding, finally, with a plainness that felt almost merciful in its simplicity, that the debt I owed had never actually been to the security system's technical failures, or to any specific unexplained shadow on a staircase camera. It was to a family I had reassured with considerably more confidence than the situation had ever actually warranted. Confidence built entirely on 11 years of training that had never once prepared me for a threat that did not require a physical body to leave a trace. I had sold them a guarantee I had no right to make, and the house, in its own patient, considerably more honest way, had spent 2 years teaching me exactly how little that guarantee had ever been worth. I still do security consulting work, though I no longer promise families that any threat can be named, tracked, and locked out with sufficient technical rigor. I tell them instead, considerably more honestly than I once managed, that a good system can catch a great deal of what comes for a house through a door or a window, and that some considerably smaller category of threat simply does not travel through either, and that I have no way of protecting anyone completely from that second category, only of helping them notice it a little sooner than they otherwise might. It is a less comforting thing to say than what I used to tell frightened families standing in their own kitchens. I have come to believe it is also the only honest thing I actually have left to offer them. I do not go back to that house anymore, not since handing the new owners the name of a colleague better suited, in every way I understand now, to continuing that particular account. I still keep, in a drawer in my office I rarely open, a copy of that final letter addressed specifically to me, and some evenings, closing up after a considerably more ordinary consultation elsewhere, I take it out and read it again, not because it comforts me, though in some limited way it does, but because I have finally stopped pretending that the certainty I once sold that family so easily, so confidently, was ever mine to guarantee in the first place. Silas Corbett had driven the graveyard shift for Corbett and Sons Towing for 13 years, covering an 80-mile stretch of interstate through Kestrel Pass that his father had covered for 22 years before him, a road nobody drove at night in winter unless dispatch or desperation left them no other choice. The pass climbed to 6,400 feet through terrain that produced its own weather independent of whatever the rest of the county was experiencing. Whiteouts that could drop visibility to nothing in the time it took to check a mirror. And Silas had learned, over 13 years, to read the mountain's moods with the same practiced attention his father had once taught him to read an engine. Listening for the specific wrongness that meant trouble was already underway, rather than simply possible. His father, Walt, had retired from the business 4 years earlier, handing the graveyard route to Silas, the way some men handed down a watch, with a specific gravity that acknowledged the thing being passed on was worth more than its practical function. Walt lived now in a small house outside the junction, called Silas most Sunday afternoons, and had, over the last year or so, developed a habit Silas had noticed without fully examining, a tendency to change the subject whenever the conversation drifted toward the pass itself, toward specific mile markers, toward any of the dozens of stories a man accumulates over 22 years of night driving through mountain snow. Silas had assumed this was simple aging, a man's memory growing selective about the parts of his working life he preferred not to revisit, and had never pressed the matter, the way a son rarely presses a father on the things a father has quietly decided to stop discussing. There was a stretch of road, specifically, that Walt had stopped driving even in his final working years, a preference he had passed along to Silas, without much explanation beyond a firm suggestion that dispatch reroute other trucks to mile marker 214 whenever possible, and that if Silas himself ever got the call for that marker on a heavy snow night, he ought to radio for backup before proceeding rather than going in alone. Silas had followed this advice loosely for years, filing it under the general category of a careful man's professional superstition, the kind every long-haul driver and tow operator eventually developed about some particular curve or crossing that had claimed enough close calls to earn a reputation. Tonight, with the sheriff's department tied up on the far side of the jackknifed semi, and no backup unit available inside a reasonable window, he had gone in alone anyway, the way the job sometimes required, regardless of which advice a man remembered too late to follow. The call came in at 1:47 in the morning on the second Tuesday of December. Dispatch relaying a report of a single-vehicle accident at mile marker 214, a sedan off the road, occupants trapped but responsive. County sheriff still 40 minutes out due to a jackknifed semi blocking the pass from the opposite direction. Silas took the call because he always took the call, the same professional obligation that had kept 3 generations of Corvettes working this road, and pulled his truck out into snow, already falling heavy enough to swallow his headlights within 20 feet. He found the sedan at 2:15, nose down in the ditch at mile marker 214, exactly as dispatch had described, a dark blue sedan, with its hazards still blinking weakly through the snow accumulating on the windshield. He parked on the shoulder, engine running, chains on, and approached with his flashlight and the specific calm he had trained himself into over 13 years of finding people at their worst moments on this road. The calm that let frightened strangers trust him enough to be pulled from wreckage without panicking and making the extraction worse. A woman sat in the driver's seat, unhurt as far as he could tell in the flashlight's beam. 2 children buckled in the back, a boy who looked about 8, and a girl younger, maybe 5. Both of them still and quiet in a way that struck Silas, even in the first moment, as slightly wrong for children who had just survived a car, leaving the road at highway speed. The woman rolled down her window when he knocked, and looked at him with an expression that held none of the adrenaline-shot fear Silas usually encountered at accident scenes, only a kind of tired, patient relief, as though she had been expecting him specifically, rather than simply hoping for anyone. She said her name was Dana Whitlock, that she had hit ice coming around the bend before the marker, that the car would not start, and the heat had gone out close to an hour ago, and that she was grateful, more grateful than the words seemed able to carry, that he had come. Silas told her this was his job, checked the children's pulses out of habit, though both looked steady, and told the family he would drive them down to Kestrel Junction himself, since the sheriff was still tied up, and the temperature was dropping fast enough that waiting was not a safe option. Dana thanked him again, the same weighted gratitude, and the family climbed into the cab of his truck without any of the fumbling disorientation Silas usually saw in people just pulled from a wreck. He radioed dispatch to report the extraction and his intended route down to the junction. 35 minutes under normal conditions, longer tonight given the snow, and pulled back onto the interstate at 2:31, the sedan receding behind him into the whiteout, abandoned for the county to deal with once the roads cleared. The cab was quiet. Dana sat beside him in the front, the children silent in the back seat, and Silas found himself filling the silence the way he usually did on these drives, asking where they had been headed, whether anyone needed to be called. The ordinary logistics that gave frightened people something to hold on to, besides the crash itself. Dana said they had been driving to her sister's place, outside the junction, a visit they made most winters, and that her husband would have been with them, except he had passed 2 years earlier, a fact she delivered with a flatness that made Silas glance over, despite himself. The specific flatness of someone who had said the sentence so many times it had worn smooth of feeling. He offered his condolences, the way he always did, and returned his attention to the road, which had begun in the last several minutes to feel less familiar than 13 years of driving it nightly should have allowed. He noticed it first as a discrepancy in mileage. He passed mile marker 211 at what his dashboard clock read as 2:38, a pace that matched his usual speed in these conditions, and continued driving through snow thick enough to require his wipers on their highest setting, watching for the marker at 2:08 that should have appeared within 4 or 5 minutes. It did not appear at 5 minutes. It did not appear at 10. When the next marker finally emerged from the whiteout, ghostly in his high beams, it read 213, a single mile behind where he had started, as though the truck had spent 10 minutes of highway driving covering less ground than a single minute should have required. Silas told himself this was a trick of the snow, the markers themselves obscured by drifts until his headlights caught them at an angle that made the numbers briefly illegible, an explanation that held for as long as it took him to pass a second marker, then a third, each one reading numbers that inched backward rather than forward. 213, then 214 again, the pass folding back on itself in a way that had no explanation Silas's 13 years of driving this exact road could supply. He tried methodically. The things a careful man tries when the world stops behaving the way 13 years of experience insists it should. He checked his odometer against the truck's trip meter, both agreeing that he had covered close to 9 miles since leaving the sedan, a distance that should have carried him well past the junction's outer lights by now. Lights that remained stubbornly absent from every direction he could see through the snow. He tried the radio and got only a low static that resolved occasionally into fragments of a voice too broken to identify dispatch or something else entirely. He could not tell which. He tried his cell phone and found no signal at all, not even the single flickering bar the pass usually offered near the ridgeline. He slowed the truck, then stopped it entirely on what he judged by feel more than sight to be the shoulder. and sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, running through the specific mental checklist his father had taught him for exactly this kind of situation. A checklist that had never, in 13 years, failed to resolve into an ordinary explanation before now. He glanced at Dana. She was watching him rather than the road, an expression on her face that Silas, in the dashboard light, could not immediately name. Something between apology and resignation. The look of a person watching someone else arrive at a realization she had reached herself a long time ago. He asked her, keeping his voice level with the same professional calm he brought to every difficult extraction, whether she had noticed anything strange about the drive. She said quietly that this was usually around when people started to notice, and that she was sorry, genuinely sorry, that it always seemed to take this long, though she supposed that was some kind of mercy in itself. Silas asked what she meant. Dana said that she and her children had been on this road before, more times than she could count anymore. That the accident at mile marker 214 had happened, as far as she understood it, only once. The actual time, the real time, 3 winters ago, on a night with snow very much like tonight's, when the car her husband had been driving left the road at the same bend, and none of them, not her husband, not her, not the children, had survived the crash that followed. She said what happened afterward, the years of it, however many years it had actually been, was some kind of repetition, the same accident replaying itself at mile marker 214 for whichever driver happened to answer the call that night. Always someone willing to stop. Always someone who believed sincerely that he was rescuing them. She described it, when Silas asked her to, with the flat precision of someone who had explained the same mechanism many times before, and had long since stopped finding new language for it. Each winter, she said, on a night that matched certain conditions closely enough, the sedan appeared at mile marker 214, exactly as it had the night of the actual accident, hazards blinking, family inside, and whichever driver dispatch happened to route toward that marker would find them, extract them, and begin the drive toward the junction, believing himself to be performing an ordinary rescue. The drive itself, she said, was where the arrangement revealed what it actually was. The markers folding back on themselves, the radio and the phone signal both failing at roughly the same point every year, always somewhere between marker 213 and marker 209, as though the road allowed exactly that much ordinary desertance before whatever governed the loop reasserted its own geography over the drivers. Silas told her this was not possible. The practical, immediate objection of a man whose entire professional identity rested on distinguishing real emergencies from things that could not be real. And Dana said she understood the impulse, that she had felt the same disbelief herself once, a long time ago, in a truck very much like this one, driven by a man who was no longer available to confirm any part of her account. She said the road kept a certain number of people moving through it each winter. Drivers who answered a call at mile marker 214 and found themselves, sometime after mile marker 213, failed to arrive on schedule, unable to locate the junction no matter how many hours they drove. The pass simply continuing, marker after marker, in a loop that had no exit, until the driver stopped believing he would find one and simply accepted the family in his cab as permanent passengers. At which point, she said gently, something in the arrangement seemed to settle. and the driver himself became, eventually, part of what waited at mile marker 214 for the next person willing to stop. Silas pulled the truck to the shoulder, an instinct rather than a decision, and sat with his hands on the wheel, while the hazards clicked uselessly against a whiteout that showed no sign of the junction's lights anywhere ahead. No sign of any lights at all beyond his own high beams dissolving into snow. He tried once to turn the truck around, some stubborn professional instinct insisting that if forward progress had stopped behaving normally, retreat might still function the way retreat was supposed to. He worked the truck through a slow 3-point turn on the narrow shoulder, chains biting into packed snow, and pointed the cab back the way he had come. Back toward the sedan and mile marker 214, and beyond that, eventually, toward home. He drove for what his dashboard clock insisted was 12 minutes, watching for the sedan's abandoned shape to reappear in his headlights, and instead passed, in sequence, markers reading 209, then 211, then 214 again, the numbers behaving no more cooperatively in reverse than they had going forward, as though the road itself had stopped honoring any direction he chose to travel in and had settled, instead, into whatever pattern it preferred. He asked Dana quietly whether turning around had ever worked for anyone. She said no, not that she had witnessed, in however many winters she had spent watching drivers try exactly what he had just tried, each of them arriving at the same conclusion by a slightly different route, some fighting it for hours, some like him, testing it once and recognizing immediately that the test would not change the outcome. She said the ones who fought longest seemed, in her observation, to suffer the most for it, the loop apparently indifferent to how hard a driver resisted, offering the same eventual settling regardless, and that she had come to think of the resistance itself as the only truly optional part of the whole arrangement, a kind of grief a driver could choose to shorten or prolong according to his own temperament, though never avoid entirely. He asked what she meant when she said the loop only ever seemed to claim one driver at a time, whoever answered the specific call at mile marker 214 on a given night, and that whoever had driven this road on all the other nights, the thousands of ordinary nights when no accident occurred at that particular marker, had presumably gone on living their ordinary lives without ever suspecting what waited unclaimed for the one night when the conditions were finally right. Silas asked what conditions those were. Dana said she did not fully understand it herself, only that it required snow heavy enough to match the night of the original accident, a driver alone, dispatch unable to reach the sheriff in time, and, she added, looking at him with an expression that had shifted, in the last several minutes, from apology into something closer to recognition, a driver whose own life carried some version of the same shape hers had, some unresolved grief or unfinished obligation that made him a plausible match for the family waiting at the bend. Silas thought, without wanting to, of his father's calls every Sunday growing shorter over the past year, of the last visit at Thanksgiving, where his father had seemed distracted, distant, mentioning more than once a stretch of road he no longer felt steady driving, a confession Silas had absorbed as ordinary aging and filed away without examining closely. He thought of the specific unexamined dread he had carried for 13 years every time dispatch routed him to mile marker 214. a dread he had never once mentioned to anyone, assuming it was simply professional caution rather than anything his own instincts already understood about this particular stretch of the pass. The children in the back seat had not spoken once during the entire drive. Silas turned to look at them now, and found both of them watching him with the same patient, tired quality Dana's own expression carried, the boy's hand resting on his sister's shoulder, in a gesture that had probably comforted her once on an actual night 3 winters ago, and had simply continued since, unchanged, through however many repetitions had followed. He asked Dana, because it seemed, suddenly, like the only question that still mattered, whether it hurt, the settling she had described, the moment a driver stopped fighting and became part of what waited at the bend for whoever came next. She considered the question with more care than she had given any of the others. The truck's heater ticking quietly against the cold pressing in through the windows, and said that she did not think of it as pain exactly, more a kind of loosening. The specific relief of setting down something heavy that a person has been carrying so long they had forgotten it was optional to keep carrying it at all. She said her husband had gone first, on their own drive, faster than she had, and that she had envied him for it at the time, before coming to understand, over however many winters had passed since, that the difference between them now was smaller than it had once seemed. Silas did not answer. He drove on into the whiteout, past the place where marker 213 should have appeared and did not, past the place where the junction's lights should have finally broken through the snow and did not, the cab quiet except for the wipers, and the low static still murmuring from the radio, a voice inside it that he no longer tried to identify, and found, somewhere in the drive that followed, that he had stopped checking his mirrors for headlights behind him, had stopped glancing at the dashboard clock to measure how long any of this had actually taken, had settled, without quite deciding to, into the particular stillness he now recognized from Dana's own face, the stillness of someone who understood exactly where the road was taking him, and had simply run out of reasons to mind. He put the truck back into drive, because there was nothing else to do on a road that offered no exit and no dispatch signal, and no lights ahead beyond his own, and continued forward into the whiteout, watching the markers count down past 213 toward 214, with a mounting hollow certainty that he already understood, before the marker itself emerged from the snow, that this drive would not end the way his 13 years of experience insisted it should, and that somewhere behind him, on a night he could no longer clearly place in the ordinary run of his memory, his own accident had already happened, and he had simply been the last one, of everyone involved, to notice. Foster Wren had been appraising estates for Truitt and Sons for 19 years, long enough to develop a private taxonomy of the dead that he never shared with clients. There were the tidy dead, who left behind labeled boxes and itemized wills. There were the sudden dead, whose homes looked like they had simply stepped out for milk. And there were the accumulators, whose houses had to be excavated rather than appraised, and who almost always turned out to have been alone for longer than anyone in town had noticed. Selwyn Marsh belonged to the third category. He had lived at the end of Corliss Road for 51 years, repairing watches and clocks for anyone willing to make the drive, and had been dead for 9 days before the mail carrier called it in. The county paid Truitt and Sons a flat $1,200 to inventory and liquidate the estate, no heirs having come forward, a distant cousin in Ohio having signed away her claim within 48 hours of being notified, which struck Foster, on reflection, as either grief or relief moving unusually fast. The house smelled of oil and dust the way clockmakers' houses always did, a smell Foster had come to associate less with machinery than with a specific kind of patience. The patience of a man who measured his life in gear ratios and escapements rather than years. The front two rooms were unremarkable. Furniture from the 1970s, a kitchen that had not been updated since. It was the workshop converted from what had once been a dining room. That took Foster 4 full days to catalog properly. Marsh had kept 214 clocks and watches in various states of repair, arranged on shelving that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, each piece tagged with a small paper ticket in handwriting that grew shakier toward what Foster assumed were the more recent additions. Most of the collection was ordinary. Mantel clocks, a handful of cuckoo mechanisms, wristwatches with cracked crystal waiting on repairs their owners had likely forgotten they'd requested. Foster had appraised enough of these estates to move through them efficiently, tagging, photographing, estimating resale value with the flat competence of a man who no longer found old machinery interesting in itself. The locked drawer was what slowed him down. It sat beneath the main workbench, a shallow drawer with a keyhole rather than the simple slide latches on the drawers above and below it, the only locked thing in the entire house as far as Foster had found. He located a key ring in Marsh's bedside table on the morning of the 3rd day, 40 keys of varying age, and worked through them methodically until the 23rd one turned. Inside was a single pocket watch, gold-cased, and a ledger bound in the kind of cloth that had gone soft and gray with handling. Foster lifted the watch first. It was heavier than its size suggested. The way certain old things are, dense with a weight that seemed to belong to more material than the case could actually hold. The crystal was intact, unusual for something kept in a locked drawer rather than displayed, and beneath it the watch face showed 12 standard hour markers, and a second hand that was, at the moment Foster looked at it, moving in reverse. He assumed at first that he was misreading the direction, a trick of the light or his own tiredness after 3 days of cataloging, but he watched for a full 20 seconds and confirmed it. The second hand swept backward, smooth and mechanical. No stutter, no sign of malfunction beyond the fact that it was counting time the wrong way. He turned the watch over. The case back was engraved, worn nearly smooth by handling, though he could still make out a maker's mark, and, below it, a single word that might have been a name, or might have been an instruction. Return. The ledger was more useful, and considerably more unsettling. It contained 61 entries spanning, as far as Foster could determine, from the handwriting changes, and the occasional dated note in the margins, close to 90 years. Each entry listed a name, a date, and a short phrase. The earliest entries were sparse. A name, a year, nothing else. Later entries grew more detailed. Foster read the most recent one first, out of habit, the way he always checked the last page of any ledger before working backward. The final entry read, Selwyn Marsh, held 14 years, 3 months, passed on the 6th of March this year, to Fr. Foster stood in the workshop holding a watch that ran backward and a ledger with his own initials written in a dead man's hand, and did the thing he always did when a job produced something he could not immediately explain, which was to set it aside, finish the inventory, and let the strangeness resolve itself into something ordinary once he had slept. Selwyn Marsh, he reasoned, had probably known someone else with the initials FR. The date could easily have been Marsh's own guess at when the estate would finally be processed. A morbid little joke a lonely man had left for whoever eventually cleared out his workshop. Foster had seen odder things left behind by people who had spent too many years alone with their own thoughts. He photographed the watch and the ledger for the estate records, valued the watch at $340 based on the case weight and the maker's mark, which he did not recognize but assumed was minor, and set both items in the box designated for the county's small claims auction, alongside 6 other pieces from the collection, deemed valuable enough to sell individually rather than as a lot. That night, back at his apartment, Foster found he could not stop thinking about the ledger entry, and did something he would later be unable to fully account for, which was to drive back to the storage unit where Truitt and Sons kept processed estate items pending auction, and take the watch home with him. He told himself this was professional curiosity, the kind of thing an appraiser was entitled to indulge given 19 years of otherwise unremarkable work. He did not examine closely why curiosity required removing the item from a locked company storage unit at 11 in the evening, rather than simply asking his supervisor about it in the morning. The watch sat on his kitchen counter for 2 days before he did anything with it beyond glancing at it while he made coffee. On the 3rd day, a Tuesday, he wound it, more out of habit than intention. The way a man who has spent 19 years around old machinery cannot leave a dormant mechanism dormant, and set it on his desk beside his laptop while he worked through the rest of the week's appraisals. He noticed the first oddity 4 days later. His kitchen clock, a plain battery-operated model he had owned for 7 years without incident, had begun losing time, not dramatically, only 3 or 4 minutes a day, but consistently, and always in the same direction, always running slow, as though something in the apartment were quietly drawing time out of every mechanism within reach. He replaced the battery. The clock continued losing time at the same rate. He replaced the clock entirely. The new one, within 6 days, had developed the identical drift. He mentioned the clock to his supervisor, a woman named Deb Ashworth, who had run the Truitt and Sons office for 22 years, and had, in Foster's experience, seen enough estates pass through her hands to be professionally unshockable. He framed it as a joke, the kind of thing you say about a house that has clearly unsettled you without wanting to admit the house unsettled you. Deb did not laugh. She asked, instead, whether he had taken anything home from the Marsh estate, a question phrased carefully enough that Foster understood she was not asking casually. He said no. She looked at him for a long moment, the look of a woman deciding whether a lie was worth challenging, and told him that Truitt and Sons had processed 2 other Corliss Road estates in her tenure, both belonging to men who had, like Marsh, lived alone for decades and kept extensive personal collections, and that in both cases, items reported missing from the final inventory had a habit of turning up in the homes of the appraisers, who worked the job months later with no memory on the appraiser's part of having taken them. She did not elaborate further, and Foster did not ask her to, though he thought about the conversation for the rest of the week. Turning it over the way, he turned over a watch to check its case back, looking for a maker's mark that would explain what he was actually holding. He might have dismissed the clock as coincidence, cheap batteries, a faulty outlet, if not for the second thing, which was harder to explain away. He began missing appointments, not because he forgot them, but because he arrived at the correct time and found the appointment had already happened, the client having left 20 minutes earlier under the impression Foster was running unusually late, when by every clock Foster owned he had left his apartment with 15 minutes to spare. This happened 3 times in 2 weeks, each time by a slightly larger margin, each time leaving Foster standing in an empty driveway or an unanswered doorway, his phone showing a time that did not match whatever time had actually been governing the rest of the world that day. The third instance frightened him in a way the first 2 had not. He had an appointment at 2 in the afternoon with a widower named Al Cochran, out past the county line to walk through a garage full of tools before the family decided what to keep. Foster left his apartment by his own watch and his own phone at 1:15, allowing what should have been an easy 30-minute margin for a 20-minute drive. He arrived at the Cochran property to find the driveway empty, the garage door down, and a note taped to the front door in unfamiliar handwriting that read, "Mr. Wren came by early. We walked the garage all set. Thank you for your time." Foster had no memory of the visit described in the note. He called Al Cochran's number from his car, and Al answered, sounding faintly puzzled. Said the appointment had gone fine. Said Foster had arrived a little before noon, quieter than usual. Had walked the garage in about 15 minutes without saying much, and had left with a polite goodbye that Al had not thought twice about until Foster was now, apparently, calling to ask whether it had actually happened. Foster sat in his car outside the Cochran house for a long time afterward, the radio off, his own hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, trying to account for 2 hours of his day that had, by every external measure, both happened and not happened to him at once. He began, without fully deciding to, sleeping with the watch in the drawer of his nightstand rather than on his desk, a small superstitious concession he did not examine too closely. It did not help. He woke on the 19th night since bringing the watch home at what his phone insisted was 4 in the morning, with the specific, total certainty that someone had been standing at the foot of his bed for some period of time before he woke, a certainty with no supporting evidence beyond the fact that his body had arranged itself into the stillness of a person who had been aware on some level below conscious thought of being watched. He reached for the lamp. The room was empty. The nightstand drawer, which he had shut and, he was fairly certain, latched before sleeping, stood open 2 inches, enough for a hand to have reached in. Before he returned to the ledger, Foster did something that felt at the time like due diligence, and in hindsight felt like the first genuinely frightened decision he made in the whole affair. He tracked down the phone number for the cousin in Ohio, the one who had signed away her claim to the estate within 48 hours of being notified, and called her on a Thursday evening under the pretense of a standard estate settlement follow-up call, the kind Truitt and Sons occasionally made when a beneficiary's paperwork needed a signature clarified. The cousin, a woman named Priscilla Dunmore, answered on the second ring, as though she had been sitting near the phone waiting for it, which struck Foster as unusual for a woman with no apparent relationship to the deceased beyond a shared surname several branches back. She confirmed the paperwork without hesitation, and Foster, working from a script he had not planned in advance, asked whether she had known her cousin Selwyn well. She said no, barely at all, that she had met him exactly once 26 years earlier, at a family funeral neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She said he had given her something that day, a small gift pressed into her hand in the parking lot afterward, a thing she had kept in a drawer for exactly 11 months before it stopped being in the drawer, without her ever having moved it, and she had not gone looking for where it went, because by then she had already understood, in the vague, unexamined way people understand things they would rather not name directly, that some objects are not lost so much as finished with the person holding them. Foster asked what the object had been. There was a pause on the line long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then Priscilla Dunmore said she did not remember, which he did not believe, and asked, in a voice that had gone flatter and more careful than it had been a moment before, whether Truitt and Sons had found a watch in the workshop. Foster said he was not able to discuss specific inventory items with beneficiaries who had waived their claim. She said that was, in her experience, the correct policy, and that he should be careful about which items he chose to become curious about. And then she said she needed to go, and ended the call before Foster could ask anything further. He sat with the deadline in his hand for several minutes afterward, in the particular kind of stillness that follows a conversation which has answered nothing directly and confirmed everything indirectly. Then he took the ledger out of the estate box, an act that required signing it back out of company inventory under a pretext about verifying its provenance, and read it properly for the first time. All 61 entries, working from the earliest legible date forward. The pattern, once he saw it, was difficult to unsee. Each entry recorded a name, a duration, never more than 15 years, never less than 6 months, and a transfer, always to a new set of initials, always phrased the same way, held, then a length of time, then passed on a specific date, to a name or initials that then reappeared as the subject of the following entry. The watch had belonged, in sequence, to 61 people across roughly 90 years, none of them keeping it longer than a decade and a half, all of them eventually passing it to whoever came next, though nothing in the ledger explained how a person decided, or was made, to pass it on. 3 of the entries included a brief marginal note beyond the standard format. One, dated 1962, reads simply, "He did not want to give it up." Foster stared at that line longer than any other in the ledger, because of how ordinary it sounded, how much like something a person might write about a stubborn relative refusing to part with an old chair, rather than whatever it actually meant in context. A second marginal note, dated 1978, was longer, written in a different hand from the surrounding entries, cramped and hurried in a way that suggested it had been added quickly, possibly by someone who was not the ledger's usual keeper. It read, "She gave it to her own daughter, thinking that would end it, thinking blood might be exempt. It was not exempt. The daughter held it 4 years, the shortest span recorded anywhere in the book. Foster went back through the earlier pages after reading this and confirmed it. 4 years, 1 month. The entry immediately following recorded the daughter's own transfer to a name that appeared nowhere else in the ledger before or after, as though whoever received it that time had ended the chain in some way the book itself declined to describe, only to have it resume 2 years later with a new name and no explanation of how it had found its way back into circulation. The third marginal note was the shortest, and the one Foster returned to most often in the weeks that followed. It appeared beside an entry from 1991, no name attached to the note itself, only 4 words in Marsh's own careful hand, the same hand that had written the final entry with Foster's own initials. It prefers the curious ones. He drove back to the Marsh house on a Saturday, a full 6 weeks after he had first opened the locked drawer, using his company key under the justification that the county had not yet finalized the auction, and he was permitted reasonable access during the appraisal period, though he understood, even as he told himself this, that he was well outside anything the job required. The house had been sitting empty since his last visit, the heat shut off, dust already resettling over the surfaces he had cleared. He went to the workshop and stood among the 213 remaining clocks and watches. All of them, he now noticed for the first time, running correctly, every hand sweeping forward in ordinary time, a fact that had not registered as significant during the inventory, but felt now like the most significant thing in the house. Only the watch in the locked drawer had run backward. Only that one had left with him. He found in a second drawer he had catalogued, but not examined closely during the original inventory, a stack of letters bound with twine, correspondence between Marsh and what appeared to be the 47th and 48th people. To hold the watch before him, a married couple in the 1990s, whose letters described, in increasingly clipped language, their attempts to give the watch to a pawnshop, to bury it, to mail it to a stranger's address selected at random from a phone book. Each letter ended the same way. The watch had returned to whichever of them was holding it that week, sometimes within hours, always intact, always wound, always running backward, regardless of what had been done to dispose of it. The final letter in the stack, dated 14 months before the woman's name stopped appearing anywhere else in the correspondence, read only, "We have stopped trying." It chooses when it is finished with someone. We think it has already chosen who comes after us, and we think it is waiting for us to notice, the way you wait for a child to work out on their own what they were always going to be told eventually. Foster drove home with the letters and did not sleep that night, sitting instead at his kitchen table with the watch, the ledger, and the correspondence spread in front of him, trying to work out what a man does with an object that appears to select its own custodians and cannot, by the testimony of at least 2 prior owners, be meaningfully discarded. He considered destroying it, and found, when he actually picked it up with that intention, that his hand would not close around it the way the thought had suggested it should. An odd, quiet resistance that felt less like fear and more like the watch, or whatever governed it, gently declining the suggestion. He put it back in the drawer. He went to bed. He woke at what his phone insisted was 6 in the morning, though the light outside had the flat, gray quality of an hour considerably earlier, and found the ledger open on his kitchen table to a page he did not remember leaving open. The final entry, no longer reading Selwyn Marsh, held 14 years, 3 months, passed on the 6th of March this year to Fr. It now read, in handwriting Foster did not recognize as his own, though he could produce no other candidate, for whose hand it might have been, Foster Wren. Held, and beside the word held, where every other entry in 90 years of ledger listed a completed duration, a length of time already lived out and closed, this entry showed a blank space. The dash sitting there, the way a door sits open, waiting for the number that would eventually be written in to complete it. On our number, nobody in the house that morning, including Foster, was yet in a position to know. He checked the nightstand drawer before leaving for work. The watch was there, wound, running backward, exactly as it had been every morning for the 7 weeks since he had first opened Selwyn Marsh's locked drawer at the end of Corliss Road. He closed the drawer without touching it, went to work, appraised 3 more estates over the following 2 weeks, none of them containing anything he found difficult to explain, and continued, each morning, to check that the watch was still there, still running, still his. In whatever sense the ledger's blank space suggested a thing like that could belong to a person at all. He called Priscilla Dunmore once more, 9 days after their first conversation, hoping she might tell him something more useful than she had the first time. Some detail about how she had eventually stopped thinking about the object she claimed not to remember. The number rang through to a disconnect message, the flat automated voice explaining that it was no longer in service. He checked the county records the following week, under the same pretext of estate follow-up, and found a death notice for a Priscilla Dunmore, age 61, dated 4 days after their phone call, cause of death not listed, survived by no immediate family. He read the notice twice and did not call the number a third time, and did not mention it to Deb Ashworth, and did not write it down anywhere, though he found, in the months that followed, that he did not need to have written it down to remember every word of it exactly. He began keeping the watch wound with a diligence he could not fully explain even to himself. A private ritual performed each night before bed, the way Marsh must have wound it for 14 years before him. The way the couple in the letters must have wound it, for they stopped trying to be rid of it. He told himself this was simple stewardship, the professional habit of a man who had spent 19 years learning that old mechanisms deteriorate fastest when neglected. He did not examine closely why an object he suspected of killing at least 2 of its previous 61 custodians deserved that kind of care from him, or why some quiet, unexamined part of him had already begun, without his permission, to think of the watch as his. He has not yet decided what he will do when the letters begin arriving at his own house, addressed to whoever's initials come after his, from whichever version of himself, 6 months or 6 years from now, finally sits down at this same table and writes, "We have stopped trying." Dr. Marisol Cady had been a large animal veterinarian for 16 years, the last 9 of them running a solo practice out of a converted barn 40 minutes from the nearest town with a proper clinic, which meant she took calls other vets turned down, the ones that required driving 2 hours into the country, where the cell signal dropped to a single bar and the road stopped having names anywhere but the county's own internal maps. The call from Amity Hollow came on a Tuesday in late October. A rancher named Elton Praise, requesting a herd health certification ahead of what he called, in a tone that gave nothing away, the valley's first frost observance. She had never worked in Amity Hollow before, which struck her as unusual given how long she had been covering the region, until she looked it up and found it was not incorporated as its own town at all. Just 14 households strung along a single valley road, closed in by ridgelines on both sides, the kind of place that appeared on a map only because a surveyor had once been required to name every parcel of land, regardless of how few people lived on it. Elton offered $2,200 for a single day's work, more than 3 times her standard rate for a herd certification, which she noted and filed away without letting it change her plans, because rural clients who felt embarrassed about their isolation often overpaid to compensate for the drive. She arrived on the last Friday of October at 9 in the morning, following directions that stopped matching her GPS 6 miles before the valley itself, the app simply giving up and displaying a blank gray road with no name. The valley, when she finally reached it, was narrower than she expected, maybe half a mile across at its widest point, with a creek running down the center and the 14 houses arranged along it in a pattern that felt less like a road and more like beads strung on the same piece of thread. The ridgelines on either side rose were steep enough that the sun, even at mid-morning, had not yet cleared the eastern slope, leaving the whole valley floor in a pale held light that reminded her, though she could not immediately say why, of standing at the bottom of a well. Elton Praise met her at the gate to his property, a broad, quiet man in his 60s who shook her hand with the particular gentleness of someone accustomed to being physically larger than everyone around him. The herd itself was unremarkable. 40 head of cattle in reasonably good condition for late-season pasture, and Marisol worked through them methodically over the next 4 hours, drawing blood, checking hooves, noting the 2 animals that would need follow-up before winter. Elton stayed with her the entire time, which was not unusual for a rancher this isolated, though he grew quieter as the day went on rather than more relaxed, watching her work with an attentiveness that felt less like curiosity and more like counting. Partway through the afternoon, a boy of perhaps 10 came down from one of the houses along the valley road and stood at the pasture fence watching her work, close enough to be noticed, but too far to be spoken to directly. The way children in isolated places sometimes observe strangers, as though gathering information to report back, rather than simple curiosity. Marisol waved at him once, out of habit. He did not wave back. He watched her hands as she moved between animals, and at one point, when she paused to make a note on her clipboard, she noticed he had been counting along with her under his breath, his lips moving through numbers that did not quite match her own tally, though she did not think much of it at the time, assuming a child's imprecise math rather than anything worth investigating. She met 3 other residents over the course of the afternoon, each of them arriving at Elton's property on some errand that seemed, in retrospect, engineered to bring them past the pasture while she worked. A woman named Ruth brought over a jar of preserves as a welcome gift, standard rural hospitality, and lingered at the fence long enough to ask Marisol, with a carefulness that felt rehearsed, whether she had ever certified a herd for a community observance before. Maros said no, this was new territory for her. Ruth nodded slowly, the way a person nods at information that confirms rather than surprises them, and said the valley would be glad to have someone thorough this year, given everything. Marisol asked what everything referred to. Ruth said only that the valley had been through a difficult stretch, and that thoroughness mattered more this year than it usually did, before excusing herself back up the road, without elaborating further, leaving Marisol with the same vague unease she had begun accumulating in small increments since she'd first lost her GPS signal 6 miles back. Around 2 in the afternoon, as she was finishing the certification paperwork at his kitchen table, Elton asked whether she would be willing to stay through the evening for the first frost observance itself, offering an additional $800 for what he described as simply standing witness. No additional veterinary work required. Marisol asked what the observance involved. Elton said it was a tradition the valley had kept for longer than anyone currently living could account for. Something to do with the herd and the turn of the season, and that having a certified outside veterinarian present this year would mean a great deal to the families, given some trouble they had experienced the previous 2 winters. She should have asked about what trouble. She would think about this omission many times in the weeks that followed, the specific moment where a different, more careful version of herself might have pressed the question rather than accepting an additional $800 to watch a harvest ceremony she assumed, reasonably, would involve nothing stranger than a bonfire and some local folklore she could recount later as a story about the strange corners of her territory. The valley's 14 households gathered at dusk in a field behind Elton's barn, close to 50 people, including children, more people than Marisol had realized lived along that single road, which suggested some of them had traveled in for the occasion rather than living there year-round. A woman named Dorothea, introduced as Elton's sister, brought Marisol a cup of something warm and dark that tasted like cider steeped with a bitterness she could not place, and explained, in the practical tone of someone giving directions rather than describing a ritual, that the observance marked the point in the year when the valley settled its account before the cold came in. Marisol asked what account. Dorothea said the valley had always given something back at first frost, in exchange for what the land continued to provide, and that this was simply how things were kept in balance here. No different in principle from crop rotation or leaving a field fallow, just older, and specific to this particular stretch of ground. She said it with such flat, unbothered certainty that Marisol filed the conversation under regional custom, the same mental folder she kept for the harvest festivals and blessing of the fleet ceremonies she had encountered in other rural counties. Over 16 years of practice. Traditions that looked strange from outside and meant nothing more than community continuity from within. She noticed, while Dorothea spoke, that the field behind Elton's barn had been prepared in advance, the grass cut unusually short in a wide circle, a ring of small stones laid at even intervals around its perimeter that she had not seen from the house that morning. She asked Dorothea how long the field took to prepare. Dorothea said the men had worked on it the previous 2 days, and that the stones themselves were the original ring, kept and reset every year rather than replaced, some of them, according to family memory passed down the valley, older than the houses currently standing along the road. She said this with the same practicality she brought to everything else, the tone of a woman describing a well-maintained tool rather than something ceremonial, and Marisol found herself unable to determine whether that flatness was reassuring or the most unsettling thing she had encountered so far. The ceremony began with the herd being walked, all 40 head, down from Elton's pasture into the field, moving slowly under lantern light in a procession that felt, to Marisol's professional eye, remarkably calm for cattle being driven after dark, as though they had done this every year of their lives and understood, in whatever limited way cattle understand anything, exactly what was expected of them. The valley's residents formed a loose circle around the field's edge. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Children were held rather than allowed to run. An older man Marisol had not met, introduced only as Cyrus, walked among the herd with a length of red cord, moving unhurried from animal to animal, touching each one briefly at the base of the skull, murmuring something too quiet for Marisol to catch, even standing close. She assumed, watching him work, that this was a ceremonial blessing rather than anything with veterinary significance, and stood with her hands in her coat pockets, the cup of bitter cider going cold, waiting for whatever came next with the patient attentiveness of a professional observer rather than a participant. What came next was that Cyrus reached the 41st animal. Marisol had counted 40 head that morning, certified 40 head on the paperwork currently sitting on Elton's kitchen table, and stood now watching Cyrus's red cord pass over the neck of an animal that had not been present in the pasture at 9 that morning, a heifer with a patch of white across one shoulder that Marisol was certain, with the specific professional certainty of someone who had spent a full day cataloging every animal in a herd, had not existed in that herd 9 hours earlier. She said nothing. She told herself she had simply miscounted, that a 41st animal had been brought down from a neighboring property sometime during the afternoon while she worked, an explanation that satisfied her for perhaps 3 minutes, until Cyrus turned the heifer's head toward the lantern light, and Marisol saw, on the animal's flank, a brand she recognized, because she had photographed a matching brand that morning on 6 different animals as part of her standard documentation. The mark belonging to a ranch 20 miles outside the valley whose owner had died, according to Elton's own offhand mention over lunch 14 months earlier. The property since abandoned, she asked Elton, standing beside her now, where the 41st animal had come from. Elton did not look at her when he answered. He said the valley provided what was needed, and that she should not trouble herself with the accounting, the same phrase Dorothea had used earlier, settling an account, as though livestock in this valley operated on some ledger Marisol was not equipped to read, the animals themselves circulating according to rules that had nothing to do with brands or property lines or the ordinary economics of who owned what. She pressed further, keeping her voice low, asking whether the animal had been purchased, borrowed, or simply found wandering after its owner's death. Any explanation that would let her file this under ordinary rural improvisation, rather than whatever her instincts were now insisting it actually was. Elton's expression, when he finally turned to look at her, held none of the earlier gentleness she had noted that morning. It was patient in a different way. The patience of a man watching someone work through a math problem he had already solved decades earlier. And he said only that the valley had never, in his memory or his father's memory, needed to purchase or borrow anything for first frost, and that the details of how the account settled itself each year were not something he had ever found useful to ask about directly, only useful to trust. He suggested gently that she might find the evening easier if she did the same. The ceremony's final stage moved quickly after that, quickly enough that Marisol's professional instincts, the ones that had carried her through 16 years of difficult births and emergency surgeries, found themselves badly outpaced by what she was watching. The 41st animal was led to the center of the field alone. The other 40 were held back at a distance by a handful of the valley's younger men, and Cyrus performed something with the red cord and a blade that Marisol's mind, even now, months later, still declined to render into a complete memory, offering her instead a series of disconnected fragments. Lantern light, the specific sound the valley made when it exhaled as one body, the particular red that is different from every other red she has professionally encountered in a career spent around animal blood. What she remembers most clearly, more clearly than the act itself, is what happened immediately after, which was nothing. The valley did not cheer or weep or show any of the emotional register Miss Marisol's mind kept trying to supply as an appropriate response. They simply began walking back toward their houses, unhurried, the children released from their parents' arms to run again. Dorothea collecting the empty cider cups with the brisk practicality of someone cleaning up after a church supper, and Elton turning to Marisol with an expression of what she could only describe, afterward, as relief, the specific relief of a man who has been carrying a debt for a long time, and has finally, this year, been permitted to set it down. He thanked her for witnessing. He said it meant a great deal to the valley to have a certified outsider present, someone whose professional word could confirm, if it were ever needed, that the herd had been properly accounted for. He handed her an envelope with the $800 in cash, counted out in bills that felt, in her hand, unnervingly clean for a rural cash economy, and walked her back to her truck with the same unhurried gentleness he had shown all day, as though nothing whatsoever had shifted between the morning's herd certification and whatever had just happened in that field. Marisol drove out of the valley that night, without stopping, and did not process what she had witnessed until she was 30 miles down the state highway, pulled over on the shoulder with her hazard lights on, her hands shaking too badly to safely continue driving. She sat there for close to 20 minutes, watching the occasional set of headlights pass on the highway below, ordinary traffic belonging to an ordinary night, and found herself unable to reconcile the two facts sitting side by side in her mind, that the world outside the valley was continuing exactly as it always had, and that inside the valley, something had just been settled that she did not have language for, and would not, she suspected, ever fully recover language for. She considered calling the sheriff's department, and did, in fact, dial the number, sitting in her idling truck with the phone against her ear for close to a minute before she hung up without speaking, unable to construct a sentence that rendered what she had seen into something a dispatcher would receive as a coherent report, rather than the ramblings of an exhausted woman who had been driving rural roads too long. She rehearsed it anyway, silently, in the cab of her truck. A community performed an animal sacrifice using livestock that did not belong to them, from a dead man's abandoned property, and she had watched it happen and taken $800 for her silence. She understood, turning the sentence over, exactly how it would sound to anyone who hadn't existed in that field, and understood with a colder clarity that this understanding was precisely what a valley like Amity Hollow would be counting on. She told herself, over the following weeks, the same things Elton and Dorothea had offered her that night, that the valley provided what was needed, that some accounts were older and stranger than an outsider was equipped to fully understand, that livestock died in ways county veterinarians were not always called to witness. And this had simply been an unusually old-fashioned method of doing something that, stripped of its ceremony, was not categorically different from any other autumn slaughter. She almost believed this. She continued believing it, in fact, until the second week of November, when Elton Praise called her practice again, asking whether she might be available the following October for the same work, the same certification, the same evening observance, and mentioning, in the same flat tone Dorothea had used to describe settling an account, that the valley had noted how well she had performed her role, and that they hoped, given how smoothly this year's first frost had gone, she might consider becoming a more permanent part of the arrangement. Marisol asked what he meant by permanent. Elton was quiet for a moment on the line, the particular quiet of a man choosing his words, the way he might choose which fence post could bear the most weight, and said that every valley he knew of that kept an observance like theirs eventually needed someone local to the practice of it, someone who understood animals well enough to recognize which one, each year, was already carrying more of the debt than the rest of the herd, someone whose professional word meant something outside the valley if the accounting ever needed defending. He said the position had been held by a veterinarian before, a man named Aldous Renshaw, for close to 30 years, until Aldous had passed the previous winter, which was, Elton mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the trouble the valley had experienced the last 2 winters that he had referenced back in October. She did not immediately understand which trouble, and asked. Elton explained, in the same unhurried voice, that a valley without a properly credentialed witness to certify the accounting had a way of running short, that the herd itself seemed to know when the ledger was being kept honestly and when it was not, and that the 2 winters following Aldous Renshaw's death had been harder on the valley's livestock and on the valley itself than any winter in his own memory. Hard enough that several families had quietly discussed whether the valley could survive a 3rd winter without someone in Aldous's role. Marisol asked, carefully, what had happened to Aldous Renshaw, whether he had simply grown too old for the work, or whether something more specific had ended his 30 years in the role. Elton was quiet again, longer this time, and said Aldous had passed peacefully in his sleep at 74, which Marisol might have accepted without further question if Elton had not added, a moment later, that the valley had made sure of it, in a tone that suggested comfort rather than confession. The tone of a man describing a mercy his community had arranged rather than anything sinister. She asked what he meant by made sure of it. Elton said only that a man who had kept the valley's accounting honestly for 30 years deserved an easy passing when his time came, and that the valley took care of its own in that way. The same way it would, he said, eventually take care of her, once she had been part of the arrangement long enough to understand what that meant. Marisol told him she needed time to think about it, and Elton said that was reasonable, that Aldous himself had taken close to a year to fully accept the arrangement after his own first observance, and that the valley understood these things could not be rushed. He gave her his number again in case she lost it, though she had not lost it, and told her, before hanging up, that he hoped she would come to see, the way Aldous eventually had, that some accounts were a privilege to help keep honest, not a burden, and that the valley took care of the people who took care of it, in ways she would understand better once she had been part of the arrangement longer. She has not called him back. She still has the envelope of cash, uncounted a second time, sitting in the same drawer where she keeps expired certifications she has not gotten around to shredding. Her practice continued through November without incident, or without incident she was willing to name as such. She treated a colicking gelding, delivered 2 calves, splinted the leg of a dog that had gotten into a neighbor's fence line, the ordinary rhythm of rural veterinary work that had structured her life for 16 years. It was during a routine visit to a dairy operation she had serviced for close to a decade, a herd she knew individually by name and temperament, that she first noticed the stillness Elton had described, in a cow named Bessa that Marisol had personally delivered 6 years earlier. Bessa stood at the back of the barn, while the rest of the herd fed, not sick by any measurable standard, temperature normal, appetite normal, every clinical marker Marisol checked coming back within range, and yet something in the animal's eyes held a quality Marisol found she now had a name for, a specific stillness she had first seen on a heifer, with a white shoulder patch in a valley 40 minutes from anywhere, and had not seen, she realized with a cold certainty that took several minutes to fully arrive, in any animal at all before that October night. She told the dairy's owner nothing. She finished the visit, drove home, and sat for a long time in her truck, outside the converted barn that served as her practice, turning over the specific horror of a knowledge she had not asked for, and could not, now that she possessed it, choose to unknow. She still has 11 months before October comes around again, and finds, more often than she is comfortable admitting, that she has begun noticing which of her own regular clients' animals seem, on certain visits, to be carrying something the rest of the herd is not, a specific quality of stillness in one animal's eyes that she has started to recognize, the way she once learned to recognize the earliest signs of a difficult birth, a knowledge she did not ask for, and does not know, yet, whether she will be able to stop using. Hey, come sit with me for a little while. Whatever today was, whatever it cost you, you can set it down now. You have done enough. These next few hours are yours, and the only thing I am going to ask of you is that you let yourself be carried. The story I have for you tonight is a dark one, but I want you sitting comfortably in the dark before I begin. There is a smell I still catch some mornings, standing in my own kitchen, coffee not even poured yet. Wood smoke, but wrong. Sweet underneath in a way. Wood smoke should never be sweet. I have a name for what causes it now. I have never once said that name out loud to another living person. I am not sure tonight is the night I finally do, but I am going to try. Well, I suppose I should tell you how I ended up on that ridge in the first place, because it was not an assignment I asked for, and it was not one I could have refused. I want to sit with you a little longer before the story starts moving, because once it starts, it does not stop kindly. I had been a fire investigator for 11 years by then, 6 with the state marshal's office, and I had built the kind of reputation you build by being right more often than you are wrong. My reports were clean, my origin points held up in court. I did not guess, I measured, and I trusted the char patterns and the pore patterns and the electrical arcing over almost anything a grieving family told me, because grief lies to itself constantly, and evidence mostly does not. I say mostly because that word is going to matter later, and I want you to remember I said it. The call came in on the 23rd of December, 3 years ago now, from a county I had only worked twice before, up in the deep hollows where the roads narrow to one lane, and the cell signal drops the moment you cross the ridgeline. A farmhouse fire, 1 fatality confirmed, a second occupant unaccounted for. The confirmed fatality was Wendell Pruitt, 71, who had lived alone on that land his whole life, except for the boy he had taken in as a foster placement. 8 months earlier, a 9-year-old named Eli Vance. Eli was the second occupant. Eli was the one unaccounted for. I remember the dispatcher's voice going quiet in a particular way when she read me that detail. The way voices go quiet around here when they are about to say something they already regret saying, and she told me the house sat on Widow's Ridge, in the hollow the old-timers still called by its original name, and that folks up there had opinions about that hollow that she was not going to repeat over the radio. I did not ask her to repeat them. I wish now that I had. The drive-in took 2 hours from the district office, the last 40 minutes of it on a gravel road that climbed steady through bare hardwoods, past a scatter of trailers and one clapboard church with its steeple leaning east, and I remember the temperature dropping the way it does when you climb into true hill country, 5 degrees, then 5 more, the truck heater working harder for less. The light was already going by the time I crested the last rise, that particular flat gray winter light that makes 4 in the afternoon feel like dusk, and the hollow opened below me the way a held breath opens when you finally let it go. I want to tell you, the house looked wrong before I even understood what I was seeing. But that would be the kind of thing I would have written up and dismissed 9 years ago. So let me tell you what I actually saw instead. I saw a burned structure, single-story, post and beam construction, with a fieldstone chimney still standing at the north end, the way chimneys almost always survive when everything around them does not. I saw scorch patterns radiating from what would turn out to be the kitchen. I saw a volunteer fire crew still coiling hose in the blue dark, their breath smoking white in the cold, none of them talking much. And I smelled it. Wood smoke. Yes, that was expected. That is always the first and most obvious thing at any fire scene. But underneath the wood smoke, there was something sweet, faint, almost pleasant, if you did not know better. the way a candy store smells sweet from the sidewalk. Before you notice, the smell is a little too close to something rotting underneath the sugar. I did not have a name for that smell yet. I would spend the better part of a week finding one. The county sheriff met me at the tape line, a heavy-set man named Purdy, who had the tired courtesy of someone who had already worked one fire that week and did not want to work another, and he walked me through what they knew standing up, the two of us breathing white into the cold. Wendell Pruitt's body had been recovered near the kitchen, consistent with a resident overcome by smoke while attempting to reach an exit. Eli Vance's bed had clearly been slept in. Eli Vance's bedroom window had been found open, screen removed, snow undisturbed beneath it, no footprints leading away, no blood, no sign of the boy at all, inside the structure or out of it. I asked Purdy the question I always ask first, the one that tells you almost everything before you have touched a single piece of debris, and I asked it the way I always do, flat and procedural, because feeling anything about it yet would only get in my way. How did the fire start? Purdy looked at me for a moment longer than the question required, and then he said the kitchen stove had been left on, an old propane range, and that Wendell was known to drink some in the evenings, and that the working theory, unofficial, was that he had left a burner lit and gone to bed, and something had caught. He said this the way a man says a thing he has decided to believe, because the alternative costs more than he is prepared to pay. I nodded, because that was a plausible cause, and plausible causes are the ones you test first, not the ones you assume. Before the light went entirely, I walked the perimeter once, the way I always do before I let myself stop for the night, and I want to tell you about that walk in the kind of detail I would never put into an official report, because a report has no place for what a hollow actually smells like at dusk in deep winter. The cold up there does not simply lower the temperature. It presses, the way a hand presses flat against the back of your neck to make you turn and look at something you would rather not. And under the ordinary char smell of a finished structure fire, there was that sweetness again, faint, almost pleasant, the way a candy counter smells sweet from the sidewalk before you get close enough to notice the sugar is sitting on top of something starting to turn. I did not sleep in town that night. There was no town close enough to matter, and the marshal's office had authorized an overnight stay on scene given the missing juvenile, so I set up in the small camper trailer the county kept for exactly this purpose, parked 40 yards from the burned structure at the edge of the yard, close enough to hear the fire scene ticking and settling in the cold all night the way burned structures do, wood contracting, metal cooling, small sounds that mean nothing and that every investigator learns to sleep through eventually. I did not sleep through them that first night. I want to be honest with you about that, even now. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, I woke to the smell again, stronger this time, close enough that for one disoriented moment, I thought the trailer itself was on fire. And I sat up so fast my head swam and my hand found the door latch, before my mind had finished catching up to my body. There was no fire. There was no smoke in the trailer at all, not really. Just that same faint sweetness under the cold night air when I stepped outside. Gone the moment I tried to place where it was coming from. I stood in the yard a long time in my socks, the cold climbing up through the ground into my feet, and I told myself it was carryover, ash particulate, still settling from the scene. Nothing more than my own nose remembering a smell it had already logged that afternoon. I went back inside. I did not sleep again that night. Not really. In the morning I began the work, the way I always begin it, methodically, from the least damaged areas inward toward the area of most severe destruction, because fire investigation done correctly runs backward through the fire's own logic, not forward through anyone's assumptions. Wendell Pruitt's body had already been removed to the county coroner. I photographed the kitchen extensively. The collapsed range, the melted knobs, the char depth on the surrounding cabinetry, and everything I measured that first morning was consistent, boringly, procedurally consistent, with an unattended open flame igniting grease and cabinetry, and running to flashover inside 12 to 15 minutes. It was, in other words, exactly the fire Sheriff Purdy wanted it to be. I want to tell you something about myself here. Something I have had 3 years, and a great deal of quiet to understand. And it is this. I am good at my job, because I trust what burns and what does not burn more than I trust what people tell me. A house does not lie about how it died, but a house also cannot tell you everything. And I had built an entire career, a whole clean, unblemished record, on the belief that if the physical evidence supported a conclusion, the conclusion was complete. It took Eli Vance's bedroom to start unmaking that belief. The room had burned less severely than the kitchen, smoke and heat damage rather than direct flame, and it was there, going through the wreckage of a child's bed with a small rake and a flashlight, the way I had done in 100 other rooms, that I found the ribbon. It was maybe 4 inches of pale blue grosgrain, the kind sold on a spool at any fabric counter, tucked into the seam where the mattress met the box spring. And it was not burned, not scorched, not even smoke-stained, in a room where the ceiling above it had blistered black with heat. I held it in my gloved hand a long moment, turning it in the flashlight beam, and I told myself the mattress fabric had likely shielded it, an ordinary pocket of protection in an otherwise ordinary burn pattern, the kind of small anomaly every fire scene produces, and no investigator worth their license gets rattled by. That is what I told myself. I want you to notice that I am telling you what I told myself, and not what I actually felt standing there, because there is a difference, and the difference is the whole story. What I actually felt, holding that ribbon, was the hair on my arms lifting under my jacket sleeves, and a dryness at the back of my throat that had nothing to do with the ash I had been breathing all morning. I bagged it as evidence and moved on, because that is what you do. You keep working. You do not let one unburned ribbon become the whole investigation. But that afternoon, walking the yard, I met the neighbor. Her name was Llewellyn Farr, 78 years old. A small, sharp woman in a wool coat 2 sizes too large, who lived a quarter-mile down the Ridge Road, and had known Wendell Pruitt her entire life. She brought coffee in a battered thermos, poured me a cup without asking whether I wanted one, and stood with me at the edge of the burn while I drank it, her breath and mine both smoking in the cold. The coffee was too sweet and a little burned, and it was, that whole long cold day, the only warm thing I touched, and I remember being unreasonably grateful for it, the heat of the cup through my gloves, her insistence that I drink it before it went cold. She told me, unprompted, that this was not the first time. I asked her what she meant, and she looked at me the way people up there look at outsiders when they are deciding whether an outsider deserves the truth. And then she told me, in 1892, Before her time, but not before her grandmother's. A house fire on that same rise had taken 2 children, brother and sister, and neither was ever found in the wreckage. In 1943, on nearly the same footprint, a family named Coulter lost 5 children to a Christmas Eve fire, and searchers combed that hollow for weeks and found nothing, not a bone, not a shoe, not a single scrap of the clothes those children had been wearing, she said. The Coulter parents spent the rest of their lives insisting their children had been taken alive, not burned, and that most folks in the hollow had quietly come to believe them. I asked her, because it was my job to ask, whether she was suggesting the fires were connected. She said she was not suggesting anything. She said the hollow kept account, and that it did not care how long between takings, and that every time it took a child, someone somewhere had already decided not to tell the truth about how that child came to be unprotected in the first place. I want to tell you I dismissed this immediately as local superstition, the kind every hollow in that part of the state seems to carry about its own hard corners, and mostly, in the moment I did. But I wrote it in my notebook anyway, word for word. The way you write down anything a witness tells you, even when you do not believe it. Because sometimes the shape of what people believe tells you something true about what actually happened, even if the belief itself is not literally so. I did not know yet how literally I would come to take it. That night the smell came back stronger, close enough that it woke me before I had fully drifted off, and this time I did not talk myself out of investigating it. I dressed in the dark and stepped out into a cold, so complete it felt like stepping into water, the moon down. No light at all, except my flashlight beam, cutting a narrow tunnel through black trees. And I followed the smell the way you follow any scent, turning my head slowly until it strengthened, then walking toward the strengthening. It led me not toward the burned house, but away from it, up the slope behind the yard, into the tree line where the ridge began its climb in earnest. I want to be honest that some part of my training, some old cold professional part of me, was already composing the incident report in my head. Unauthorized nighttime movement off a secured scene, poor judgment. And that same part of me kept walking anyway, because underneath the smell of wood smoke I could hear, faintly, something else. A sound almost like breathing. If breathing could be slow enough and wrong enough to make the small hairs on the back of my neck stand up one at a time, like something counting them as they rose. I stopped at the tree line. I told myself it was wind moving through the bare branches. Small thing, small thing. The kind of sound any hollow makes on a windless night when you are cold and tired and primed by an old woman's story to hear things that are not there. And I stood there telling myself that, for longer than I would like to admit, my breath coming shorter than the cold alone accounted for. Then the sound stopped, all at once, the way a held breath stops when the person holding it decides you have noticed them. I went back to the trailer. I did not sleep again. In the morning, I found boot prints in the yard that did not match any of the firefighters, small ones, a child's size, leading from the house toward the tree line, and stopping exactly where I had stopped in the dark. I photographed them before the frost took them. I did not put that photograph in my report. I want you to understand that this was the first time in 11 years I had ever withheld physical evidence from a fire report, and I told myself it was because the prints could have belonged to any child in the hollow, any curious neighbor kid. drawn to a burned house. Nothing that needed explaining in an official document. That is what I told myself. I keep telling you what I told myself, and I keep needing you to notice it, because that is where this story actually lives. Over the following 2 days, the pattern that Llewellyn had described to me began, slowly, to reveal itself, the way patterns always do, to someone trained to look for them, which is to say quietly, at the edges, in details too small to mean anything until you have enough of them lined up in a row. The unburned ribbon, the child-sized prince stopping at a tree line where sound stopped too. A second interview with Llewellyn in which she mentioned, almost in passing, that Wendell Pruitt had a reputation, not spoken of loudly, for being harder on the boy than the county's foster placement paperwork would ever reflect. A reputation the county had apparently chosen not to look at too closely, because good foster placements were scarce up that hollow, and nobody wanted to lose one over rumor. I sat with that detail a long while, alone in the trailer, the coffee gone cold in my hands, because I recognized the shape of it. I recognized it the way you recognize your own face in a window at night. Unexpected and impossible to unsee once you have seen it. And what I recognized was Caleb. So, well, I suppose this is the part I have been walking you toward the whole time. And I am going to tell it to you plainly, because plain is the only way I have ever been able to tell it to myself. 9 years before that hollow, I investigated a trailer fire 2 counties south, and I ruled it electrical, accidental, an old panel box, overloaded by a space heater running through a winter cold snap. A 6-year-old boy named Caleb Whitfield died of smoke inhalation in a back bedroom while his mother's boyfriend was passed out on the couch, 12 feet from an unlocked door. My report was thorough. My report was correct. As far as the burn pattern went, nothing in that trailer told me the space heater had been placed against the wall on purpose, close enough to catch, on a night the boyfriend had been drinking, and the mother was working a double shift 2 towns away. 2 years after I closed that file, a caseworker who had handled an earlier complaint about that same boyfriend called me, unofficially, off the record, and told me there had been bruising on Caleb documented at a pediatric visit 4 months before the fire. Bruising nobody had connected to my investigation, because nobody had thought to ask a fire marshal to look at a child's medical history. She asked me if that changed anything. I told her the physical evidence still supported an accidental ignition, which was true, and I did not reopen the case, which was a choice. And I have spent 9 years telling myself those 2 facts were the same thing. They are not the same thing. I understand that now in a way I did not let myself understand it then. Standing in that trailer on Widow's Ridge, holding a cold cup of Llewellyn's coffee, I understood that I had not simply made a professional judgment call 9 years earlier. I had been given a chance to ask a harder question about a boy nobody else was asking questions about, and I had let my own clean record answer that question for me instead, because reopening a closed case is expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money. And I had decided quietly that Caleb's file was not worth what it would cost me. I sat with that understanding a long time. I did not cry, not that night. That came later. What I want to tell you next is the part where the horror stopped being something I was investigating and became something that was unmistakably investigating me back. And it began the following evening, my 3rd night on the ridge. When I woke not to the smell alone, but to a weight at the foot of the trailer bed, small and slight, the mattress dipping the way a mattress dips under a child's weight, and not a moment before. I did not move. I want you to understand what that stillness cost me. Lying in the dark with my heart slamming so hard I could feel it in the roof of my mouth. Every instinct I had built over 11 years telling me to reach for the flashlight, and every animal part of me telling me that reaching for anything at all would be the wrong choice. The weight shifted once, the way a child shifts when they are trying to get comfortable, and then a voice, small and flat and entirely without threat in it, said 4 words into the dark. You already know how. I did not answer. I could not have answered if I had wanted to, because my throat had closed around the answer, the way a throat closes around something it refuses to swallow. And I lay there in the freezing dark with my eyes open and my whole body gone rigid, and after a while, I could not tell you how long, the weight lifted from the mattress, and the trailer was simply mine again, empty and cold and ordinary. I did not sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I found on the small fold-down table where I had left my case notebook the ribbon I had bagged as evidence 2 days earlier, lying loose on top of the closed notebook. The evidence bag itself nowhere in the trailer at all. I checked the evidence lockbox in my truck. It was still sealed, still logged, still exactly where procedure required it to be. The ribbon on the table was identical. Pale blue growth grain, 4 inches, unburned. I told myself, standing there in the gray morning light with the ribbon in my open hand, that one of the deputies must have gone through my notebook overnight, careless with evidence they did not understand the chain of custody on, and that the missing bag was a procedural failure I would need to document and nothing more. It was, I remember thinking, almost a relief to have a rational culprit to be angry at, instead of the alternative sitting quietly underneath that thought and refusing to leave. I walked straight to Purdy's command trailer and asked Flat, who had been near my rig overnight. He looked at me the way he had looked at me the first evening that beat too long before answering, and told me the county's overnight unit had sat at the mouth of the driveway the whole night, same as every night, and that nobody, not one deputy, not one volunteer, had walked up to my trailer at all. He pulled the log to show me. 2 names, 2 sets of timestamps, headlights parked at the road the entire shift. And when I asked him plainly whether he believed that log, he did not answer me for a long moment, and then he said something I have carried since. He said his own grandmother would not set foot past that tree line after dark, not once in 70 years, and that he had stopped asking her why sometime around age 10, because some questions in that hollow you learn not to keep asking. I went back to the trailer that afternoon and did what I should have done the first night, which was pull Wendell Pruitt's property file at the county courthouse, deeds and prior incident reports going back as far as they were kept on that parcel. Buried in a folder of yellowed clippings someone, Wendell or his father before him, had saved and never thrown away. I found a 1943 newspaper account of the Coulter fire. 5 names listed under a single grainy photograph of 5 children standing in front of a Christmas tree, and beneath the clipping, in a hand gone brown with age, someone had written a single line, not lost, kept. I sat with that clipping a long time, the courthouse radiator ticking somewhere down the hall, and I understood that whatever I had been telling myself about carryover ash and careless deputies had run out of road. I am not going to tell you I understood, in that moment, exactly what was happening to me. I understood only that something in that hollow had chosen to speak directly to the part of me that had been avoiding a conversation for 9 years, and that it intended to keep speaking until I answered. I spent that whole day trying to work the case the way I would have worked any other case, and I failed it steadily and completely, my hands shaking faintly over evidence bags in a way they had not shaken in a decade, my mind circling back, over and over, to a small useless worry that had nothing to do with anything, whether I had remembered to lock my own truck back at the district lot 2 hours south, a truck that was not even on scene, a worry I could not stop returning to, because it was the only thing in that entire day small enough for my mind to hold without breaking. I want to tell you that worry embarrassed me, even as I was standing in it, and that I let myself have it anyway, because it was the only quiet corner left in a day that had none. By the fourth evening, the sheriff's office had brought in cadaver dogs and a wider search team for Eli, and I stood at the edge of the yard watching the dog handlers work the tree line without result. The same tree line I had stood at 3 nights running, and Llewellyn found me there again. Another thermos, another cup, pressed into my cold hands before I had asked for it. I asked her, directly this time, what she thought happened to those children, all of them, across 80 years. She said the Hollow did not take children out of cruelty. She said, it took them, when the adult meant to protect them had already failed to, and someone with the standing to say so, out loud, had chosen silence instead, and that the Hollow kept what it took, unchanged, waiting until the silence broke. She said it had been waiting a very long time. I asked her, my voice steadier than I felt, what would happen if the silence never broke. She looked at me for a long moment, the cold between us, and she said the Hollow was patient, and it had all the time there was, and it would simply keep counting. That night, the fourth night, I did not wait for the wait at the foot of the bed. I walked out into the yard before full dark, my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust the way you learn to, in true country dark, and I stood at the edge of the tree line where the child-sized prince had stopped 3 mornings running, and I said, out loud, into the cold, that I was listening. The temperature dropped further, all at once, the particular kind of cold that has weight to it, that presses rather than simply chills. And the trees went still in a way. Trees do not go still on their own. And somewhere closer than I was prepared for, I heard breathing again, slow and wrong and patient. My body moved before my mind decided anything. 1 step forward, off the yard and into the tree line, my boots finding ground I had not chosen to walk on. And it was only the sudden bright bark of Purdy's radio crackling behind me in the yard, dogs alerting somewhere down the slope, that broke whatever had my legs moving on their own. And I stood there in the trees, with my heart going, and my hands shaking, and understood, plainly, that whatever this was had been about to take me exactly where it had taken Eli and every child before him. I turned back. I want you to know that turning back was the hardest thing I have done in longer than that one night, and I am not speaking only about the walking. The dogs, it turned out, had found something after all. Not remains, nothing so final as that, but A small patch of disturbed ground 40 yards into the tree line and buried shallow beneath it. A child's shoe, one shoe only, unburned, laces still tied in a double knot, the way a nervous child ties laces when they are trying very hard to do something right. I held that shoe a long time before I bagged it. I thought about Caleb's small sneakers, still in an evidence photograph in a file I had closed and never reopened, and I understood, with a clarity that felt less like realization and more like something finally being allowed to surface, exactly what I was going to have to do. I called my supervisor before I called Purdy back with the find. I told her I wanted to reopen the Whitfield case, 9 years cold, on the basis of information a caseworker had given me that I had failed to act on at the time. I told her this would likely trigger a review of my own conduct, and that I understood that, and that I wanted it to happen anyway. She was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then she asked why now, of all times, in the middle of an active scene 2 counties from where Caleb Whitfield ever lived. I told her I did not fully know how to explain it in a way that would hold up in any report, and that I was asking her to trust me on that one point without the explanation, and that I would carry whatever came of it. She said she would start the paperwork Monday. I closed the Pruitt investigation the following week with a finding of accidental ignition, propane range, consistent with the physical evidence, because that finding was true as far as it went, and I have learned since that being true as far as it goes and being the whole truth are not the same thing, and a good investigator owes the difference to everyone the fire touched, not just the ones who can no longer ask for it. I added an addendum to that report, the first of its kind in my career, noting the documented history of unresolved child fatalities associated with that specific parcel across 80 years, and recommending the county open a broader inquiry into placement oversight in that district, going back at least 2 decades. It was not evidence in the way a burn pattern is evidence. I filed it anyway. I have never once regretted filing it, even though it cost me exactly what I expected it to cost me, a formal review, a note in my own file that will follow me the rest of my career, a version of myself that no longer gets to think of her record as clean. Eli Vance was never found. I want to tell you that plainly, because I promised myself I would tell this story honestly, and honesty does not always come with an ending you can rest inside. But the Whitfield case was reopened 3 years ago now, and it is still open, and the caseworker who called me all those years back testified before a county board last spring about oversight failures that reached further than one boyfriend and one bruised boy. And I sat in the back of that hearing room, and I did not say a single word, because for once, it was not my job to be the one talking. I still smell it, some mornings. That sweetness under the wood smoke, standing in my own kitchen, 2 counties and 3 years away from that hollow. I no longer try to explain it away. I kept the ribbon. It sits in a small dish on my desk now, next to a photograph of Caleb his mother gave me at the reopened hearing. And I understand, finally, what it always was. Not a keepsake of Eli's, and not the Coulter children's either. It was every unfinished ribbon in that hollow at once, tied loosely around whatever a grown person had left undone, waiting for someone with the standing to finish the knot. I think it is not the hollow that follows me now. I think it is simply the shape of what I owe worn into the back of my throat the way a debt wears a groove into whoever finally agrees to carry it. And I have stopped trying to set it down. Some mornings I just stand there with my coffee going cold, and I let myself remember his name.